In the world he lives in, dungeons keep popping up. Dark caves crawling with skeletons, insects, and ogres. Endless labyrinths full of traps and huge minotaurs. And of course, the Towers of Trials, which had the strongest bosses. This world is called the World of the Great Dungeon. In each location is hidden a lot of treasures, and only adventurers exploring all corners of the secret places will get wealth and glory. However, not everyone can become an adventurer. Only the chosen ones can get this chance. A wanderer stepped onto the ground with a huge sack over his shoulders. A guard blocked his way and said that there was a dungeon in front of him, and only those who were authorized to enter it were allowed. "Who are you, a courier?" the man asked. On the guy's chest hung a round medallion with the image of a sack. "I'm Dungeon the Courier," he said with a smile. He had a porcelain rank, and his name was Nagi. The hunter scratched the back of his head looking at him, and in bewilderment he remarked that these were very strange times. With the sapert coming later than the adventurers, the youth had become quite lazy. The group of hunters sighed heavily. Nagi apologized and said it was his first time here, and he had lost his way a bit. The man asked why he was alone and where the other porters were, since they had paid 50 gold to the Courier Association. Nagi remarked that he was the one they had hired for 50 gold a day. The guard was very angry that only one courier would work for 50 gold. After all, the dungeon they were traveling to needed at least 4 or 5 helpers. Nagi tried to explain himself, but the hunter continued to be angry. How could he alone handle the loot they would take? After all, he wouldn't even be enough for the load they were carrying. The warrior became even more angry, and he ordered the courier to return to the association for the rest of the helpers. Otherwise, they would cause the association a lot of trouble. There was indeed too much cargo for the 4 adventurers to carry. There was no way Nagi could handle it alone. The guy realized that such a reaction from adventurers was a common thing. It's not every day you meet a courier who charges 5 times the usual amount. But in a case like this, it was useless to explain anything. It was much easier to show what he could do. Nagi opened the huge sack he was carrying over his shoulders. He easily packed it with all the backpacks the adventurers had. The adventurers watched him with their mouths hanging open. "What did you just do?" one of them asked. After packing everything into a sack, the courier easily slung it on his shoulders. The hunters had so many questions. What was it? Where did he get it from? Wasn't it heavy? They wanted something like this for themselves. "It's a magic pouch," he replied. The courier apologized with a smile and said that no one else would be able to use this unique bag. "I hope you don't doubt me now," he asked. One of the adventurers asked not to make a fuss. "It's an ordinary bottomless bag," said Mr. Jeffnam. He accepted the messenger. Mr. Jeffnam had a gold rank, was a swordsman, and was the leader of the Dawn Wolves unit. But he warned the courier that he had to justify his price and work for the 5 of them. If he failed to do so, he would be held accountable. Nagi realized that this blond man was the leader of the adventurers and looked rather stern. Jeffin gave the command to his men to prepare their gear and set off soon. "It's even for the best because I'm a professional," Nagi thought, smiling. Until the end of the mopping up of this dungeon, he was ready to fulfill their needs completely. They set off on their way, and soon they were near the entrance of the cave. Nagi gets a lot more money than the other couriers. But it's not just because of his abilities. It's all about the adventurer's satisfaction score. Upon entering the cave, they lit a torch. The adventurers went ahead, the courier followed them. Adventurers who clean up dungeons face many dangers. After all, there are traps that can appear at any moment. And of course, surprise attacks. At this moment, they were being attacked by goblin trolls and spiders. The adventurers were ready to take the fight. "They're coming!" Jeffin shouted, pointing his sword in the direction of the wickedness. They began the battle. One of the hunters impaled the troll with his spear. The other shot an arrow through the goblin's head. Jeffin fought with his bare hands. Clearing a dungeon requires being prepared for many surprises, and that means a lot of stress. The fight was difficult as they let their guard down. Jeffin reprimanded his subordinates for being inattentive, which they were not happy about. On this ground they had a disagreement, and the warriors started an argument. It was for this reason. Nagi decided to take over the niche. He knew how he could reconcile them and stop the bickering. "Gentlemen adventurers," the courier addressed them loudly with a wide smile on his face. He began to untie his sack. Nagi assumed they were hungry from the constant fighting. "I think it's time for a snack," he said. A divine odor began to spread through the cave. The adventurers were very surprised when Nagi pulled a plate from his sack, on which appetizingly lay huge chunks of roasted meat on the bone, surrounded by fresh vegetables. They didn't understand where so much food had come from. Meanwhile, Nagi had prepared a huge table with all sorts of treats. This was the special skill of a dungeon restaurant courier. The adventurists pounced on the huge pieces of meat. The food was plentiful and hot as if it had just been cooked. After a week on breadcrumbs and jerky, this food seemed divine to them. They wondered how the messenger bag kept the food fresh, or maybe it had a cooking function. Smiling, the guy pointed out that something else was important. That wasn't the most amazing thing this bag could do. He opened it up again. Didn't take long to search inside. The courier pulled out a water hose, another special skill of the courier land of eternal bliss. Nagi quickly filled the bathroom for one of the adventurers. The man was perplexed and delighted at the same time. It seemed to him that he was in a hot spring resort, in the middle of a snowy landscape. The view was actually a little different. The bathroom stood in the middle of a dark cave, but the man was impressed. Jeffin was not happy about this development. He didn't understand how one could fool around in a dungeon. He asked for it to stop. Although on the bright side, the baths had already been drawn, Jeffin still gave in to temptation and jumped into the warm water. Yeah, at this rate, they won't even have anything to complain about. Jeffin admitted that they wanted to ditch the association. After all, few people were capable of rendering decent services for 50 gold pieces, and this way they could get their money back. But now it seemed to them that 50 gold pieces was even cheaper for the service they had received. Nagi was amused by this. Warming his hands by the fire, he replied that if he was going to clean up the dungeons, he'd better do it in comfort. Outsiders think that the difficulty of a dungeon depends on strong monsters. But in fact, more often than not, the reason for failure is tension and unexpected factors throughout the process. For example, if you don't eat right, it can lead to indigestion. Or, for example, because of lack of sleep, you may not notice an attack and not be able to dodge it. These stories happen quite often. The couriers in the dungeon are essentially dependent on the adventurers. To get their money, the adventurers must successfully clear the dungeon. Thus, Nagi does his best to help them in this regard. Though he doesn't consider it such an outstanding ability. One of the adventurers laughed a lot. He felt that to call it insignificant was an excessive modesty. Such service was hard to get even from the outside. After such care, you feel a huge surge of energy. You start to feel that you can handle any enemy. The courier was pleased to hear that. The adventurer assured him that he needn't worry about mopping up the dungeon. As promised, the sweep went smoothly. They fought many more of the evil ones. Initially, their team was quite experienced, so they were able to deal with the monsters quickly. The problem arose with the boss. They always behave unpredictably. Jeffin had already prepared his sword. He realized that this boss was very complicated. The leader ordered his team to not give him a second's respite and attack all the time. But the monster wouldn't give up. With his huge clawed paws, he flung the archer away. He, in turn, quickly got up, loaded his crossbow, and shot the monster in the paw. It was a special shot of 7 arrows. Threads of webbing formed between them, which at the same moment chained the paw firmly to the cave wall. Webbing was a special skill of the archer. The monster continued to attack. The man with the shield blocked the blow of the monster that tried to attack them with its tail. The defender struggled to contain his attacks. Jeffin raised his sword at his opponent's tail. Applying a special warrior skill called a powerful strike, the sword severed the monster's tail in a second. The razzed monster roared loudly and began spewing fried green plasma from its mouth. The team continued to attack him. Plasma, with even more power, erupted. Jeffin was adamant. Courier watched their fight from behind the rock that served as his hiding place. He could see the monster filling the cave more and more with plasma. Nagi realized that this time they had gotten the boss lizard, Zarkum, with difficulty level B. And judging by the skill of the adventurers, the odds of a sweep exceeded 80%. But even with those solid odds, the remaining 20% could not be ignored. It was clear that if the adventurers died, he would gain nothing and would be in a dangerous position. Therefore, it was unacceptable to let them fail. He decided to help them out a little and slipped his hand back into the bag. After searching for a bit, he exclaimed, "Ah, here it is." In his hand was something round and shining. The bright light made it impossible to make out what it was. The adventurers have enough power to attack. The courier was holding a mushroom with a shining cap. The courier was holding a mushroom with a shining cap. That smoking mushroom was worth a lot of money. It was a shame to waste it. But mopping up was the priority right now, so there was no choice. Nagi spun the mushroom harder. Now all he had to do was hit his target. He saw an angry lizard, and the way Jeffin keeps fighting him. If only the monster would stop moving, then the courier could get a better aim. He needs to catch the moment when the lizard will attack the adventurers. Nagi threw the mushroom straight at the monster with all his might. It hit him right in the head and created a huge cloud of smoke. The acrid smoke made the monster begin to choke and cough. Jeffen hadn't expected such help. He glanced at the messenger, who in turn raised up a red pom-pom and shouted, "Now!" Smiling, the commander understood everything and rushed to the attack. He jumped onto the rest of the monster's tail. Climbing up his back, the commander pierced the lizard's head with his sword in a leap. The monster collapsed to the ground, sticking its tongue out of its mouth. "Good work, take the spoils," Jeffen addressed his underlings, standing on the lizard's head. It could be said that the dungeon cleanup went smoothly, but their joy was short-lived. The atmosphere became tense. The reason was that the reward was pathetic. The boss was supposed to drop at least 20 Class B magic stones, but there were only 5. The rest was useless junk. And the dungeon was filled with ordinary goblins. To put it in ordinary terms and compare the cost of the sweep to the reward received, it was a complete failure. Besides, the adventurers needed to divide the reward among the 4 of them. For this reason, the joy of the sweep disappeared and the atmosphere in the team heated up. The adventurers started arguing amongst themselves over who would get the bigger piece. When it comes to sharing, the camaraderie disappears immediately. They continued to argue with even more bitterness. Nagi basically didn't care about the problems of adventurers. It didn't concern him. The courier would still get a flat fee no matter how much they made. So before things got too bad, it was time to call it a day. Anyway, they've done a good job. It's time to celebrate. Surely the crew was thirsty for a drink. Nagi was just in time. "Here's a drink for you," he offered, holding up a bottle of liquor. This idea seemed like a very good idea to them, considering how hard a fight they had. Jeffen was pleased that even in this situation he cared about them. He was also particularly excited about the smoke bomb Nagi had thrown at the boss. He felt that meeting with this courier was their greatest good fortune in this dungeon. The boy felt uncomfortable. He felt like he was being overpraised. He decided to clarify that he had only helped a little with his modest skills. But the team was extremely disagreeable to him, because the more they spent time with him, the more he surprised them. They were shocked at how many amazing things coming from his sack the courier had already managed to present to them. It suggested that perhaps there was more treasure in this sack than in the dungeon itself. Maybe in the time the guy's been working as a courier, he's amassed a decent fortune? After all, he is a porter who gets 50 gold pieces. As the commander had already managed to point out, really the biggest luck in this dungeon is meeting him. The warriors no longer looked so benevolent. Now they looked to match the wickedness that inhabited this dungeon. The atmosphere was getting stranger and stranger. The courier was in a very tense state of mind. As he continued to hold the drink bottles in his hands, he felt one of them shattered by a quick shot. Puzzled, he looked around and realized it was an arrow fired by an archer. The only question in his mind was, what the hell? The arrows kept coming one after another. He had to work very hard to dodge their flow. They just kept flying through the air. Utterly exhausted and unable to stand, the porter fell to the ground. "What do you allow yourselves?" he shouted with impotence. "Ah, sorry," the archer retorted. He stopped firing for a short time. He admitted he just wanted to shoot the guy in the head so he wouldn't suffer. Adventurer is a profession where you have to risk your life, and that's true. But is it fair to pay garbage for that risk? They had no personal grudge against him, just that the Seekers needed to repay a debt, which would cause them a lot of trouble if they didn't. Besides, the adventurers didn't think the porter needed that much stuff anyway. They hovered over him like demons. "This is how it turns out," the courier pondered, rising up on one knee. "So true, the job of a dungeon porter does involve a constant risk of death," he thought as he got to his feet. If they killed him and said it was the work of goblins, no one would think to suspect anything strange. Nagi was frustrated, for no matter how much he tried to help the adventurers, they still saw him as a tool. Even those who had previously appreciated his efforts. Once the moment passes, they all start looking at him as prey. But he's used to it, so he's not at all surprised by this course of things. He hasn't lost his temper in a long time. After all, in this world, such things are commonplace. In a world where class is defined from birth, each has its own meaning and purpose. A hierarchy of classes in which the courier, the lowest of them all, he is always perceived that way. That's the way it was before. That's the way it remains now. From the moment he first gained this ability, his ability was sack. The boy was followed everywhere by looks of contempt. With an ability like that, they wouldn't even register him as an adventurer, pointing out that his ability was for logistics. In order for him to participate in the dungeon sweep, he had to register as a courier. The world was making it clear to him that he could not become an adventurer, branding him a courier. And these people probably think the same way. The adventurers had already prepared to attack, ordering Nagi to give up everything he has or die. With an exclamation of "damn peddler," The man brought his spear over the courier's head, ready to strike. The bearer began to deftly dodge the swings of the spear. Well, is it his fault he was assigned to the courier business? Nagi decided it was time to use his bag again. Sticking his hand in, he started looking for something. Taking a sword from his bag, he deftly deflected another spear strike. The adventurer couldn't believe the courier had the strength to do that. The guy managed to stop his powerful punch. The bearer planted her foot more firmly on the ground and pushed off. In the blink of an eye, he flew upward and swung his sword over the man with the spear, delivering a crushing blow with the hilt between the eyes. The impact was so strong that the man with the spear flipped in midair and fell to the ground. The archer who was watching was furious. He didn't understand how this was possible. The courier, in turn, had a special surprise in store for him. Pulling an axe out of the bag, he sent it flying. As it flew toward the archer, the weapon hit the crossbow, shattering the arrows in it and ruining the trigger mechanism. The team of adventurers froze in place with their mouths hanging open. Jeffen still couldn't figure out what was going on. After all, it had never happened before that Dolph had been overcome. He lay motionless on the floor. The team commander was overcome with incredible rage. He ordered the team to gather and finally kill the pesky courier. Armed with mace and knife, they rushed at him. Nagi was ready to give them another surprise. He rummaged around in his bag and pulled out the hose he had recently used to fill the bathtubs of his abusers. The courier directed a powerful stream of boiling water toward the adventurers. From the unbearable pain that enveloped them, the team howled. The bearer continued to deliver crushing blows, pulling more and more surprises out of the bag. He was outraged at the injustice that haunted him. The courier continued his massacre. With a swing of his sword, he split the shield of one of his opponents in half. The adventurer's eyes read terror and fear. That fear fueled Nagi. He struck his crushing blows harder and harder, leaving them no chance. The adventurers, one by one, were defeated. Nagi felt his superiority. It was time to move on to the next one. Jeffen stood looking at how deftly the courier handled his command. He couldn't believe his eyes. Fear and hatred gripped him. It's impossible that one porter would be able to overpower 3 adventurers. That can't be right. After all, the guy only had a China rank. Who was the messenger after all? Nagi stood in the middle of the cave, carrying a huge sack filled with different kinds of swords. With a smirk looking directly into the commander's eyes, he uttered, "I, dungeon courier." The courier left the dungeon, taking the bound adventurers with him. While at the entrance to the cave, Nagi heard something loudly approaching them. It was the clatter of the wheels of a wooden wagon. He was surprised and pleased. With a smile, he waved his hand and beckoned to me. The wagon stopped and someone got out. A pretty girl came down to the ground. She was dressed in a blue uniform with a notebook hanging on her shoulder and a white beret on her head. Her name was Petra. She had a porcelain rank and was a dungeon inspector. "You're Naga's courier-san, right?" she asked. "I was sent by the guild. We received a report of a crime." She saw the adventurers bound, their backs to each other, sitting on the ground. Nagi stood beside them, scratching the back of his head. Petra didn't understand why the adventurers were in such bad shape. Their faces were bloated and purple in color. Dropping to one knee and looking at the adventurers, she tried to figure out what was going on in the dungeon after all. As he began to untie the sack, Nagi wanted her to hear for herself. Sounds began to emanate from the slightly opened bag. The girl could hear clearly the voice of each of the adventurers, the way they demanded to give up everything the courier had, the sounds of battle, and the inexplicable cruelty towards him. She could hear everything that was going on in the cave. She was unusually surprised. The girl stood there with her mouth open. At the sound of the screams that kept coming from the bag, she took the notebook off her shoulder and began to take notes. She was surprised by the bag-shaped recorder, its design seeming completely ineffective, which she hastened to point out in her notes. Nagi pointed out to the inspector that it was more like a bag with a recorder function. In any case, it was clear to her that the adventurers had handed over the courier and were trying to kill him. The evidence she'd gathered in such a short time was enough. However, what was more interesting was another thing. How an ordinary courier like this guy could defeat 4 adventurers. Looking at the state of the adventurers, the girl suggested that they might be poisoned by ash mushrooms. Nagi was unusually amused by this. He was also surprised that she knew about the existence and effects of ash mushrooms. Of course, she knew they were found in this region, just as she knew that eating them caused muscle cramps, dizziness, and a purple tint to the face. With a smile on his face, the courier began to tell me that these guys had accidentally eaten the mushroom stew. It was a stupid accident, just as they were about to attack him. Sudden sounds interrupted the porter's story. The source was Jeffen, and he began to vomit. I think the symptoms were beginning to show. Nagi was lucky, otherwise how would he, an ordinary courier, have been able to connect the adventurers? Looking at the crimson faces of the adventurers, the courier's smile never left. He bent over one of them and asked, "Isn't it true, Mr. Adventurer?" The boy with the swollen face, sweat dripping down his face, opened one eye with difficulty and replied that everything that had been said was a lie. The adventurer said that they had indeed eaten the poisonous mushrooms, but that they had not done so willingly. They had fallen into his trap before the battle had even begun. Memories of the events that took place began to swirl in the courier's mind, and he found himself back in the walls of the cave. Swinging his sword, he asked the adventurers if they were really adventurers of the golden rank. Striking the team leader courier clarified that perhaps, in fact, their rank is actually China. The strikes of the bearer's sword continued to crush the adventurers with incredible force. Nagi wore down the adventurer's leader by striking harder and repelling the blows with ease. Jeffen could feel himself growing weaker. With each swing of his sword, the strength was leaving him more and more. Even if they spent most of their energy fighting the boss, some courier couldn't overpower them. That's nonsense. Ha ha ha! You're so slow! How did you even manage to survive against that gobla? Attacking again, the porter teased. The adventurers lost to a fucking porter. How bloody humiliating. Exactly. He just pissed them off and took advantage of their confusion. From the last of his strength, swinging his sword, the commander ordered the delivery man to take his bag and get the fuck out. The only question was how the porter had so much strength. Nagi looked pleased and alert. The duel with the team leader continued in the same vein. Jeffen threw punches, the courier deftly dodging. "Oh, almost got it," he quipped. It was looking more and more like a fight show, with Nagi knowing his opponent's next move. The sword was charged with Jeffen's maximum available power, but it wasn't enough to get any closer to realizing the plan to destroy Naga. The Dunge courier wiggled and scoffed while his opponent was perplexed as to how this was possible. In a fit of rage, the blonde focused his strength for another strike. With a sweeping attack, Jeffen was sure he had hit, but Nagi just skipped under the sword like a limbo dance. Jeffen was finally starting to realize what was going on. After all, the reason they lost to the courier wasn't because he was strong. The reason was that they had weakened. Nagi froze in place, looking directly at the commander. A flame blazed in the courier's eyes. The ringleader's body suddenly weakened. He could not understand what was happening to him. He dropped to one knee and held his hand to the ground. He felt like he was going to throw up. He was so sick. "Oh, right, I didn't tell you?" Smiling slyly, the courier began his speech. "You are poisoned," he said, and burst into loud laughter. The food they ate recently had ash mushroom, which is considered poisonous. It not only improved the flavor of the dish, but was also a kind of insurance against vermin such as adventurers. Two birds with one stone, as they say. The commander found it hard to believe it was true. But if it's as the porter says, so he had been plotting to betray them from the beginning. The commander shouted in anger, his face turning red and his eyes filling with blood. With a smug smile, the courier confirmed the leader's hunch. It was just as it had been. After all, how could he, a frail courier, trust treacherous adventurers like them? But this plan was really just an insurance policy. Whether he poisoned them or not depended on their own actions. In this situation, the courier used an accelerant to make the poison take effect faster. Nagi admitted that he had planned to give them a drink to completely neutralize the poison after completing the task. However, some idiot broke it. Still, the courier had one more bottle left, even though it happened the way it did. If Jeffen now says that the porter poisoned them, it won't sound credible, so he had to admit that everything Nagi had told the inspector was true. It just so happens that they accidentally ate the soup. After all, a great team can't admit that they were defeated by a courier. If only they hadn't eaten that soup. Perhaps they wouldn't be in such an embarrassing position, sitting tied up at the entrance of the dungeon with swollen purple faces. Trying to explain to the inspector about the events that had happened just before. After listening carefully to everyone, Petra made her decision. The situation was clear. What remained was to transport the criminals. She ordered the guards to put everyone on the wagon. Throwing in the bag on his shoulders, the courier was ready to leave. But the inspector's voice stopped him. Pointing to the wagon with her hand, she offered to give him a ride if he was going to town. Nagi stopped and thought for a moment. He had not expected such a suggestion from the inspector. After a little thought, he asked, "Is it free?" and laughed at the top of his voice. It was a long walk, and the courier was already tired, so he gladly accepted her offer. They climbed into the inspector's wagon and set out on the road. In the wagon, the girl shared that she was very sorry because the porter had to face such an unpleasant incident. Barely he had just arrived in this city. On behalf of the Adventurers Guild, she brought her changes. The guy told her not to worry. Couriers encounter this kind of thing every day. Shoving his hand into the bag, he started looking for something. The inspector understood that, but there was something he should have known. She had seen the porter stick his head into the bag at one point in the search and look for something. Turning toward the adventurers who were sitting in the wagon behind the bars, she explained to the porter that even though this case was not the courier's fault, the guild would not look into such things. The adventurers he captured belonged to the Dawn Guild. This guild is known for its arrogant behavior in the region. If their members are offended, they are sure to retaliate. Shifting her gaze to Nagi, she warned him that he needed to be careful for a while. Suddenly, her speech was interrupted. It had all happened so fast. She stared at the courier in confusion. The girl saw the unknown creature suddenly emerge from the courier's sack. The guy's head was completely in his mouth. She asked Nagi if he was listening to her. In response, she heard his muffled voice, which answered in the affirmative. With a sharp jerk, he released his head from the creature's jaws after all. The boy named the creature Gluttony. Nagi told him not to show his face in public. People get scared when they see him. He started pushing it back into the bag. Not going back, the creature yelled that it was very hungry. This frightened the inspector, and again, taking out her notebook, she quickly began to make a note of the strange creature in the bag. She kept asking the porter what this strange thing was. Smiling awkwardly and scratching the back of his head, the guy explained that there was nothing special about the creature, asking the inspector not to worry. The creature was black in color, had a glowing yellow belly, and pointed ears. At some point, it began to live in his bag, and now it was doing a lot of good for the courier. He helped sort things. Before he showed up in it, it was impossible to find anything there. But in exchange for his work, he eats a bunch of magic stones. Well, after everything that happened in that dungeon, he probably had a lot on his plate. Gluttony kept yelling that he wanted rocks, that he wanted food. The guy broke out into a wide smile, shyly covering his mouth with his hand. Besides, the loot from the dungeon was originally supposed to be divided among the four of them. But because of the incident, the entire award went to him alone. After a little thought, the courier decided to give the creature twice as many magic stones today. That made the little one very happy. He crunched the huge golden stone with pleasure. The girl had never seen creatures feeding on magical stones before. To be honest, other than Gluttony, Nagi hadn't seen anyone else either. But since he wasn't hurting, it could be said to be a mutually beneficial relationship. The guy was becoming more and more smitten with Petra, although it might be more accurate to say that it was the bag that squeezed him. She'd never heard of anything like it. Suddenly, the carriage jerked sharply, and the horses gave a loud roar and started stomping their hooves. Nagi, the inspector, and the guard almost fell off the wagon. What had the horses so excited? They didn't know, but something had clearly spooked them. The courier was thinking about something. A strange feeling swept over him. The wagon stopped on a stretch of road in the middle of the forest. Without a doubt, it was a dungeon breakthrough. But why had it happened here? Nagi turned to the inspector. He held a finger up, pointing in the direction. Behind the mountain, a dungeon breakthrough could be felt. He pointed to a high mountain with a bright light coming from behind it. What? A breakthrough to the dungeons? The inspector was agitated. It was bad enough, but how did the courier know about it? Perhaps he had some sort of magical device to detect such things? They stood staring off into the distance at the bright light. Naga had what they call flair. The girl had little faith in the mysterious abilities of the porter. Clutching the side of the wagon tightly with his hand, he realized they were out of time. He clenched his teeth in anger. The courier knew he had to hurry to avoid casualties, the guy told the inspector. Petra thought it was absurd to rely on a gut feeling. Even she, the inspector, felt nothing. It's true. There really is a breakthrough to the dungeons, the creature from the bag echoed back. He liked magical stones. He could feel them over the mountain too. It was just an unreal delicious smell. With burning eyes, the little boy looked toward the mountains. He's sure. Petra looked at him in disbelief, but there was still some interest in her eyes. After giving it some thought, the inspector decided to go and have a look. to confirm or deny the courier's theories. The wagon set off. The bearer and the inspector stood at the foot of the mountain. They watched the whirlwind of flame come from the rift. Dungeons that have existed for too long eventually enter a state of breakthrough, and monsters from within burst out, wreaking havoc and death. That's why in this world, they are obliged to mop up the dungeons. They looked at the rift in which a whirlwind of flames raged. This was a real breakthrough into the dungeons. It looked like it was ripe and about to burst. The boys stood there with their mouths hanging open, unable to take their eyes off it. The girl wondered how Nagi was able to sense it at such a distance. He simply couldn't forget the feeling. The courier began to have flashbacks, memories of everything going up in flames, horrible monsters that burned everything around them. All the subterranean evil had gotten out and was turning the world into chaos. And he's in the middle of it all. During the breakthrough, a veritable hell on earth ensues. Looking at him, the inspector thought that perhaps this man had experienced a breakthrough. But even if he had survived it, could he really feel it? She was overcome with doubt. Nagi realized that something still didn't add up. If the dungeon is located so close to the village, the adventurers couldn't help but sweep it. The girl started flipping through her notebook. Right. The records indicated that this dungeon had already been taken over. Could you be more specific about who exactly was clearing it? Nagi asked. This dungeon of rank D was commissioned by one adventurer of mithril rank and 2 adventurers of copper rank. The mithril adventurer's name was Dura Khan. The copper-ranked adventurers were Bondeshtar and Naranero. The picture wasn't coming together in the courier's mind, a mithril adventurer on a normal D-class dungeon. He fixed his gaze on the split. There was clearly something wrong here. Nagi decided to go down to the village to check something out. He motioned for the inspector to come with him. You suspect the very thing, right? She asked. The girl gave the guards orders to go in her place, to take the criminals to jail. As a dungeon inspector, it was her duty to escort the courier. Together they traveled to the village, leaving the site of the split. The ancient one was surrounded by mountains. Among the many green trees, houses made of stone and wood could be seen. Once inside the village, Petra and Nagi saw a crowd of locals discussing something, some of them upset, some of them talking angrily. It looked like something really happened. People were screaming about how it had been a long time since the adventurers were supposed to have cleaned it up, and it was still there. What would they do if there was a break in the dungeon? Their questions were answered by 2 black-clothed men. A man named Bandeshtar, he had a copper rank and was a necromancer. And a woman, her name is Naranero, she also has a copper rank and is a melee player. Any questions for the raid leader? Replied the woman to the crowd's questions. We don't know anything, the man said, crossing his arms over his chest. How could they help them if the raid leader was missing? The man verbally tried to fend off their attacks. The residents were very unhappy, continuing to yell at the couple, telling them what bastards they all were. Nagi stood looking around the crowd. Everything was clear to him. Judging by the situation, his assumptions were correct. Cancel the raid. This happens mostly when the raid leader's level is higher than the dungeon level. They register a request for a low-level dungeon, but if they find a more favorable dungeon, they just ignore the lower one. Petra was puzzled. After all, the guild fines for such negligence, doesn't it? That's still too lenient a punishment, isn't it? It is. These residents stand to lose everything. The adventurer will get off with a simple fine. This dungeon will be breached as early as tonight. Even if Petra and Nagi requested help from the Adventurers Guild, this village would already be in ruins by the time they arrived. Even in such a situation, these adventurists only wave away and talk nonsense. Ben Deshtar continued his discussion with the crowd. We're the victims too. The raid leader is missing and we're left with nothing. The breakout is no longer our concern. Do what you want, he voiced. Shouting at his opponent, he suggested that if he had a grievance, he should file a formal complaint with the guild. They weren't responsible for that, and they didn't have to listen to nasty things from people. Adventurers are not heroes or defenders. Nagi was well aware of that as he watched the squabble. These upstarts who only care about their own gain. Even so, it is the power of adventurers that is needed in this situation. Only they can prevent the dungeon from breaking through. At times like this, Nagi regretted that his class was courier. Now they have to evacuate the residents. Saving their lives was the priority. Petra understood that perfectly well. The carrier wasn't so sure. He doubted the men could be saved. He clutched his messenger medallion tightly in his hand. The inspector had not expected such indecision from the boy. What did he mean by that? Nagi smiled broadly as he thought of a plan. He knew that winter was coming soon. If people lose their homes, will they be able to survive such a long winter? He clutched his medallion more and more tightly in his hand. No, that's impossible. He ripped the hated piece of jewelry from his neck and tossed it as far away as he could. What this village needs now is not a courier. A golden circle glittered in Nagi's hands. So, the carrier burst out laughing. What a stroke of luck. Went into the village for a while, and there's a dungeon break. He tried to speak louder so the adventurers could hear him better. He managed to get their attention. Nagi embarrassed the inspector with his question. After all, if the dungeon rupture was eliminated, the reward from it could be taken away without any commissions. Right? Which the girl hesitantly confirmed. It's just a gift of fate for the courier. Bandeshtar and Naranero stared directly at him. He was of genuine interest to them. Who is he? Is this guy really going to sweep the dungeon? When they noticed the color of his badge, their eyes rounded. Was there really a gold-ranked adventurer standing before them? Around Naga's neck glittered a golden, round medallion with the image of a sword inside. The guy invited them to join him and promised to split the reward 9-1. With a sly smile, he waited for them to answer in the affirmative. The idea was quite real. Therefore, Nagi temporarily became an adventurer. Smiling nervously, the courier asked a question addressing Petra. By the way, Inspector, what is the fine for illegally assuming the title of adventurer? As far as I know, it starts at 1,000 gold pieces, the girl replied. Nagi tensed up. Damn. This portal leading to an uncharted dimension is a dungeon recommended only for adventurers with a rank of at least gold. Normal dungeons, no matter how high in complexity they may be, will eventually, it comes down to destroying monsters. But in the abyss, the enemy is space itself. Even an experienced adventurer cannot foresee the conditions for completing this dungeon before entering it, which increases the risk of disappearance or death many times over. That's why this dungeon is avoided. Moreover, Petra, Nagi, and the adventurers had to pass this dungeon in a certain amount of time. The newfound team stood at the rift, looking at the whirlwind of flames. Judging by the magic limit, this dungeon would begin to collapse in an hour. In other words, if they wanted to prevent the destruction, they should go through it in an hour. But in 1 hour, it will be very difficult to handle any challenge, especially if you're in the abyss. Nagi's only hope was that they would come across an easy dungeon. They didn't have a second to lose. Without wasting any more time talking, the team headed into the split. Something's happened. The energies are colliding. There was an explosion. A bright flash of light illuminated the whole place. They tried to see something through the bright light. Suddenly, everything stopped. They saw high mountains and rocks floating in the air. It was night outside, and here it was day. It was amazing. The adventurers did not hide their delight. The guy and the girl happily began to explain themselves. This is how the historic first dungeon sweep of the Dungeon of Rising Star Bana Deshtar began, the guy was saying with a smile on his face. Gotta show those guild assholes what's what, the girl answered him. The guy assumed that when the guild saw what they were capable of, their jaws would drop. Having unwittingly become listeners of the adventurers' conversation, Nagi and Petra began to better understand the expression, "in ignorance is bliss," because as soon as Petra saw all this, she thought they were finished. Nagi couldn't disagree with her. The guy decided to stay out of the way of the dreamers and ignore their silly chatter. The flying stones led upwards, straight to a castle located on a stone island high above them. The whole structure is like saying, "Welcome to hell." Looking up, Petra and Nagi thought through their actions. They needed to get to the end in an hour. That's why the courier had lied about being one of the adventurers. On the other hand, his intentions were not evil, so the inspector was not going to dwell on it. But she was very angry with him. They had no other choice. After all, if the guy had asked the adventurers, posing as a courier, they would have been unlikely to help them. But it's hard to say no to a gold rank. It's the kind of thing you can fight with as a team. It might be far-fetched, but if the dungeon wasn't cleared, there would be a breakthrough. Petra knew that. That's why she came here. A dungeon breach must be prevented. If not, the villagers would be in danger. The blonde started licking her fingers. Then the girl with the cat ears moved on to licking her shoulder. She couldn't understand what was bothering them so much. It was the reason Naranero couldn't stand slow people. The blonde assumed the pose of a cat before jumping. She knelt down and put out her claws. She could have made it through the lightness on her own. She pushed herself off the ground and jumped from rock to rock, aiming upward. Her partner didn't like it. Her actions seemed dangerous to him. The girl felt a powerful energy begin to constrict her wrist. In a split second, that force began to pull her down. Naranero didn't realize what was going on. Flying down past a pile of rocks, she fell right in front of Bandeshtar. The boy resented it. Just like in the training camp, the girl acted first and thought later. He started to tell her off. Realizing her foolish act, she asked him to stop swearing. How do you not scold her? There could be debuffs or curses in the portals to the abyss. They'd been through this so many times at camp. She was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. Naranero knew that. She had just forgotten a little. The adventurers are right. The inspector raised her index finger upward, forming a small blue cloud. In the portal to the abyss, the first thing to check for is the presence of the curse. To do this, Petra used her special scout skill, detection. Energy formed on the adventurers' wrists. Like shackles, she shackled them with chains. It seemed to be the curse of the dungeon. The team stood bound in invisible shackles. Now they must move together without being separated from each other, much to Naranero's dismay. It looked like tricks wouldn't work in this dungeon. Luckily, the newfound team had plenty of climbing gear, which was found in Nagi's sack. The blonde cat-eared girl was surprised by his huge sack, holding a climbing hook, the rope of which went deep into the bag. Nagi prepared to try to move forward, one step at a time. One step at a time. This is the key to such spatial dungeons. There's no need to rush to avoid wasting your strength. But you shouldn't slow down too much either, keeping an optimal pace. Then it would be possible to reach the goal. Nagi moved at the head of the team, ordering the others to follow his pace. We shouldn't forget that they were chained together, so the distance couldn't be too great. It was necessary to keep an optimal distance and move forward. The blonde with the cat ears didn't like this arrangement. She thought their leader was walking too slowly. She wanted to lead the group and run ahead. Nagi forbade her to do so. It's better to go slowly but with a well-thought-out route than to go fast and lose time on the way back. I mean, even if you follow the exact route. The problem was that there are always a lot of variables to be found in the abyss, like a huge, winged stone pig hovering in the air. Opening her mouth, she sucked in the rocks that flew past her. Once in its mouth, they began to break into small pieces. The pig ate them with a crunch. This situation seems to be a dead end. Nagi watched the huge unknown monster. Petra decided to look up the answer in his notebook. This monster is called a stone-eating pig. Although it is a strong monster, it is not aggressive unless provoked. The guidebook said that they dwell in places with a lot of rocks. But the fact that they were even found here was surprising. According to the source, it also emits waste quickly. A stone ball flew out from under the pig's tail with an appropriate sound. It eats and excretes waste, thus changing the structure of the dungeon. This dungeon ecosystem is incredible. Nagi was amused by the inspector's satisfied look. It was just her first time seeing it in person. But anyway, they have a problem. The platform they wanted to climb on was completely destroyed. They had only one way left. Throw the hook that was in Naga's hands on the stone pig and attach the rope. But if they miss, they'll provoke her. The stone pig could become aggressive. The team didn't have the time or energy to fight. In that case, Bandeshtar is up for the challenge. It looked like his finest hour had arrived. Needing his right hand, he asked the leader to watch carefully. The adventurer thrust it forward. The hand began to heat up. When the heat reached its maximum, an explosion followed. Two of the guy's fingers separated from his hand and flew forward. Falling down, the fingers began to transform into something. It was a necromancer's special skill, finger summoning. It caused pieces of the necromancer's flesh to transform into two sturdy warriors. They were segmented golems, pebble, and cobble. Surprising. The summoning ability was very rare. The team looked at their newfound help in delight. All except the girl with the cat ears. If the summoned creature caught the hook, they could attach the rope without provoking the stone pig. Looking at the golems, Nagi noticed something odd about their behavior. Moving soldiers trembled. The neck of one of them snapped to the side with a loud crunch. They were moving strangely. They were twisting their limbs, bending in different directions. Naranero told the team that in the camp, Bandeshtar was nicknamed Explosive Ban. No one trusted his summoned creatures, because his control over them was mediocre to say the least, and at the end, all of his minions exploded. While in hypnosis, the guy continued to control the golems. He asked them to be quiet. After all, Controlling the summoned creatures is like looking in a mirror and moving the left hand separately from the right. If he maintained control for no more than 5 minutes, he'd be fine. He hoped so. Nagi and Petra continued to watch the soldiers dance on the back of the stone pig. Though it looked uncertain, but time was short. So Nagi prepared a hook. They need to get through quickly before the whole thing explodes! He swung and sent the gun flying. Hook rushed forward, holding the hand of his comrade, who in turn held onto the stone pig. One of the soldiers reached out to catch him. Past his hand, the hook went straight into the golem's head. It smeared it and lodged itself firmly inside. At the same moment, the necromancer grabbed his head with a scream. During the summoning, part of the consciousness is connected to the creatures. You have to be careful. Nagi apologized and asked to be patient for a moment. The courier began to climb up the rope. Although it's a very difficult dungeon, they were still a bit lucky. The abilities of the adventurers accompanying them proved useful in this dungeon. The boys were already at their destination. Especially those minions, it will be pretty easy to get through the dungeon with them. At the finish line, the leader sensed something had gone wrong. It had only been 3 minutes, but the hook was slowly starting to leave the soldier's head. The crew members felt themselves getting seasick. They asked Nagi to hurry up. Bandeshtar realized what was about to happen. He apologized to the team. The golem should be exploding any minute now. The crack that appeared on the golem's head as a result of the hook hitting it was out of control. The soldiers began to swell. Through the stitches in their bodies, a pink light began to appear. The golems were getting bigger and bigger. At one point, they looked like a balloon. Eventually, a bright light burst out. There was a large explosion, a cloud of smoke and chunks of rock flying around. The hook was no longer holding onto anything and was floating in the air. Snapping off the rope, the guys promptly began to fall downward, trying to grab onto the air currents. They were scared and screaming at the top of their voices. Everyone was trying to grab what they could. We had to start all over again. Nagi couldn't let that happen. If they fell back to the starting point, they would never make it to the top. Right now, we should at least minimize our losses. He reached into his bag. Rapidly, the bag began to take on air and inflate. A special new messenger, an air cushion. The bag ended up on one of the boulders, similar to the ones the boys were flying past. They took turns landing on it, ending up on top of each other. When the last member of the team landed, the bag pushed them out, and the guys were in the air again. The courier's foot stepped on the ground. When they reached the top of one of the rocky islets, they began to catch the sack. Nagi was the first to grab the end of the rope that dangled from the sack. He pulled the sack up. "Is everyone all right?" He turned to the team. Thanking him, Petra almost let slip, almost calling him a courier. She managed to stop herself just in time. Naranero cheered the necromancer as he lay on the ground, saying how good he was. Time was running short. The inspector lamented that they had lost much of their progress. Would they make it to the top in time? Petra looked up at the castle in the distance. They have no choice. The courier turned to the adventurers. His eyes were filled with anger. In a blink of an eye, he started yelling at the couple. Now he could no longer adjust to their stamina. The boys hadn't expected this. Everyone would have to pull themselves together to make it in the time left. He put a glove on his hand in the shape of a frog's paw. It's a special courier item, an adhesive climbing kit. He handed out the kit to his team. The boys donned gloves and special shoes. All except Naranero, she refused. Now they would have to walk vertically all the way to the top. The necromancer wasn't ready for that. They can't let their guard down. If one falls off, they all fall. The closer to the top, the more traps and variables will arise. As they traveled, they passed an area with falling rocks, trying to keep their balance on a patch of ice. We also tried to keep our composure on the narrow log section, on which a stone monkey threw surprises in the form of banana peels. In the explosive rock section, they came across a flying boulder. You can't touch it. It was an explosive rock. Such a thorny path took a lot of their energy, and they were exhausted and begging for rescue. They did not know how long they had left to climb. Nagi cheered them on, telling them that they were almost there, that they had to be patient a little longer. It was the 10th time he had said it. That made the exhausted adventurers very angry. Naranero would rather fight monsters than climb mountains. That's not why she became an adventurer. The courier stood his ground, convincing the girl that this time he meant it. He stood looking at the castle, which was on a huge stone island. The top of the castle was already visible. The castle walls were well protected. It seems that the boss monster of the location is waiting for them at the top. The pink monster slept soundly in the cold embrace of the castle's stone walls. The adventurers were overjoyed. They had met a monster. At last, Bane Deshtar's first official fight would take place. The girl is ready to deal with the boss monster and show those guild assholes who only gave her a copper rank what's what. That made her feel stronger. Bane Deshtar couldn't help but agree with her. How could the guild do this to them? They were the elite of the training camp. We need to put them in their place. But, looking at them, Nagi realized that judging from their physiological abilities and talents, these two were indeed above the copper rank. It's probably because necromancers are despised and beastmen have only recently stopped being slaves. The blonde was determined. Worst case scenario, the leader of the group would be able to handle it. The necromancer agreed with her. It was logical. He was a gold-ranked adventurer after all. Nagi felt awkward. He had taken them just to deal with the monster. Something was bothering Petra and she asked them to wait a bit. Looking at the pink monster, she realized that something was wrong here. The monster boss at the top was a lindworm, but their species does not have a purple color. If a lindworm turned purple, there is only one way to do it, in the event of his death. The monster's eye sockets had a white coloration. He was already dead. Nagi didn't expect this. There was a sword sticking out of the lindworm's body. The blond man's rest was disturbed by some sounds. He had been resting gloriously before. With his hands behind his head, he rested his back against his prey. A sword protruded from the dragon's body. Hearing voices coming from downstairs, he decided to check it out. It can't be. Glancing at the castle, Nagi saw the dark figure of a man near the cliff. Could he be dangerous? The leader didn't know that. One had to be prepared for anything. Standing at the cliff, the man on top of the castle didn't think for long and decided to act. He pushed off harder and took off, heading in the direction of the adventurers. Confused, not knowing what to expect, they stood on a piece of land floating in the air and awaited their fate. A strong stream of air enveloped Nagi. Lightning fast, the huge man was on the team's island. From such a powerful landing, rocks flew from under his feet, flying apart. A round medallion adorned his chest. The man looked directly into the leader's eyes. The commander only cared about one thing at that moment. Naga's gaze was fixed on the jewelry on the warrior's chest. Mithril rank, so it's not a raid cancel. The man complained about the resulting problem in the form of the adventurous team. The warrior stood in the crater that had formed, surrounded by adventurers. He believed that no one could enter this dungeon. After all, there was going to be a breakthrough here. The man looked down at the confused opponents. Nagi was outraged by this. Sometimes you meet people like this. It would be more accurate to say non-humans who purposely set up a dungeon breach. Why did it have to be so complicated? The big guy had a brilliant idea. The four of them will be presumed dead during the dungeon sweep. That's a great idea. All right, it's done. In this world, people registered in the Adventurers Guild are given a rank corresponding to their abilities. The initial lowest rank is porcelain or off-white. These include dungeon couriers, dungeon miners, guild office workers, and other professions with no combat skills. The next stage is the novice adventurer level, copper rank or copper. This rank is given to those who have at least minimal combat abilities. They are stronger than normal people, but they cannot be relied upon in the dungeon. And the next rank is silver or silver. These are the experienced, skillful veterans. Those who are able to perform their tasks in the dungeon without any problems. According to the guild's statistics, most adventurers belong to this level. Above that is the gold rank or gold. Adventurers who reach this level can lead dungeon clearing squads. This rank is reserved for those who have great talent or a lot of experience. This is the end of the standard adventurer levels. But sometimes, you can find those units that belong to the elite of elites. Mithril rank or mithril. People refer to adventurers who have reached this level as gods who have risen above the human race. Only those who surpass the limits of human understanding can reach this level. The warrior stood in the crater that had formed, surrounded by adventurers. He thought that no one could enter this dungeon. Nagi felt uneasy. Drops of sweat dripped down his scales. The large warrior had such a crushing aura. The leader felt uncomfortable just looking at him. Just by looking at him, it's clear that even the four of us can't beat him. He radiated incredible strength and power. There was something devilish, sinister in his eyes. The leader turned to the inspector. Perhaps she knew this adventurer. Petra knew him. There weren't many adventurers of mithril rank in this city. The girl had previously talked about the unceremonious Dawn Guild. This person is their squad leader. A huge, invincible blonde man. This is a berserker named Dullahan. The inspector's face looked familiar to the big man. That's right. She's the same girl who works at the guild. What's a chick like her doing in this godforsaken dungeon? Maybe she's playing the adventurer. What Dullahan didn't understand was, why do it by just being white? Petra had gathered many questions for the bulky man as well. For example, why isn't Mr. Dullahan of the Dawn Guild cleaning up this dungeon? She approached the big man at point-blank range and began her interrogation with great fervor. This dungeon is about to rupture. Preventing a rift is an adventurer's first duty. The man was amused by the nature of the girl's questioning, watching her with a smirk. Duty? This is ridiculous, he laughed. Leaning over her so that their eyes were on the same level, he asked wryly, "What other duty?" Petra clenched her hand into a fist. He explained that adventurers are only driven by their own profit. For example, sometimes breaking a dungeon can be more profitable than clearing it. The girl didn't understand why he was saying that. Nagi felt a great sense of disappointment in the adventurers. He'd never thought of adventurers as heroes or brave, but he'd never imagined that there were scum that badass. If he really is going to set up a dungeon rift, the leader will do anything to stop him. His hand automatically clenched into a fist. But he's mithril rank. Fighting him head-on would be insane. His hand resumed its relaxed position. It was time to turn to the bag again. Nagi reached for the strap. Digging into his sack and cracking a smile, he turned to Dullahan. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding, Mr. Adventurer." The courier succeeded in getting his attention. The bearer told the warrior that they had only accidentally stumbled upon this dungeon and decided to look into it, and seemed to have accidentally interrupted him. As a sign of reconciliation, the guy gave a gift, the master's famous shish kebab. Dullahan began to look at the food. The kebab looked very appetizing. Even though it was out of the bag, Nagi assumed that the warrior had gotten hungry while in the dungeon. He suggested he try the food before it got cold. Direct confrontation with this scumbag is not an option. The courier had a plan. The bully needed to be weakened. The hungry giant was happily eating the juicy chunks of meat. Hot, like it was just cooked. It was extremely delicious. The man ate it with great speed, stuffing both cheeks. The warrior didn't hide his delight. The kebab was really incredible. The meat is cooked evenly and the shrimp is cooked perfectly. You can kiss the courier for such deliciousness. Dullahan could eat as much as he wanted. That's what it took to make him eat as much as he could. The kebab had been prepared especially for him, according to a special recipe. Nagi chuckled to himself. Suddenly, the warrior's hand came down on the courier's shoulder, squeezing it. The bully had tasted all the ingredients. He began to thank the courier. The ash mushroom added to the sauce gave it an exquisite flavor. It was delicious. Did Nagi really think such a cheap ploy would work? The courier wasn't ready for this. Shit, it's all gone. Dullahan brought his fist up over the porter. He was going to thank him properly for the treat. A powerful blow followed to the head of the cook. It was so strong that Nagi flew off the stone platform and promptly began to fall downward. The situation was worse than expected. In the blink of an eye, his team followed him one by one. Petra was already in the air. It was the turn of the blonde with the cat ears. Energy enveloped her wrist. The girl felt invisible chains begin to drag her off the platform. Her feet were already starting to lift off the ground. Trying to push herself against the ground, she resisted the effects of the energy with all her might. Being at the edge of the cliff, she saw Nagi and Petra land on the small island below. The chains were still binding them. The girl looked at her wrist. What to do now? Naranero heard the warrior behind her approaching her. She broke into a cold sweat. Dullahan was amazed at the team's unpreparedness. These underachievers couldn't even break the curse of the chains. How unlucky for them. She had a hunch it wasn't good. Preparing to attack, the warrior began to gain acceleration. Naranero took a defensive stance. This dungeon could be their grave. The forces were not equal, she realized that. It didn't make sense to just stand there. We must act. Bondeshtar is ready to engage. In a second, a powerful explosion engulfed the platform. Everything was flooded with bright light, and a column of smoke rose upwards. The clouds of smoke were so thick that it was impossible to see anything through them. Dullahan stood motionless, staring into the thick clouds, giving them time to dissipate. A pathetic, summoned spirit appeared in front of him, with the necromancer and the blonde behind him. Does this undertrained necromancer think he can handle a mithril-ranked adventurer? Bondeshtar remembered something. After all, this warrior was the group leader who had agreed to participate in the dungeon, and then just didn't show up. The thug stood with his arms folded across his chest. He too realized what his opponent was. A fool to venture into this despised dungeon. That's funny. Dullahan looked at them, rubbing his chin. A necromancer and a member of the Zvaroras. It's hard to imagine a more useless piece of trash for a thug. Bon Deshtar cheered Naranero up, setting her up for battle. There's no need to be adrift. When the commander returned, it would be 3 against 1. Until then, they just need to hold on. The adventurers prepared for battle. Especially if the attacks were physical, his indestructible golem could last as long as he wanted. Just like in training. The trio rushed toward the warrior. The thug greeted them with a smile. There was another explosion in the middle of the islet, visible from the lower platform Nagy and Petra were on. The commander was unconscious, sitting leaning against a rock. A trickle of blood was visible at the corner of his lips. A loud noise made him open his eyes. With a cry, he came to his senses, his eyes rounded. Sitting beside him, Petra asked if he was all right. After the fall, she gave the commander as much first aid as she could. Thanking the girl, he asked about the situation. He'd been out for a while, after all. Honestly, the situation is not good. Naranero and Deshtar are fighting hard. Dullahan toppled the golem to the ground. Holding its face with one hand, he struck with the other. He struck the golem with his other hand, hurting Deshtar incredibly. Naranero jumped in ready to land a leg kick. The warrior lifted the golem lying on the ground by its head, using its body as a shield. As he covered himself, he fended off the girl's blow. Doing a pirouette, she managed to stay on her feet. And then she attacked again, striking again. Dullahan wrapped his arms around the golem and twirled it in a dance, continuing to use it as a shield. The blows created fiery craters on its back. The jolt stopped, and the warrior, deflecting the golem, peered out from behind his shoulder. His eyes shone with fury, his face stretched in a sinister smile. He grabbed his shield and began to unwind it. In his hands, the golem became a handy tool. The golem had become a handy tool in his hands. It was clear that against him, they would not last long. This battle is not an easy one. Nagy considered it his miscalculation. It should have been foreseen that the poison might not work on an adventurer of the mithril rank. Petra was alarmed by the information about the poison's use. The leader asked the inspector to elaborate on the thug. If he had mithril levels, he must have been known in various circles. Petra confirmed it. It is said that he is unrivaled in melee combat among mithril-level adventurers. He has considerable experience in clearing dungeons. He has also often clashed with other adventurers, so he is familiar with dueling in great adventurer competitions. Especially his technique of wielding a huge sword. They say he cut the ogre in half with one punch. That's good news. At least he doesn't have that sword now. It was looking more and more to Nagy that the bulky man was not vulnerable. Even if by some improbable means they managed to overpower him. Time was almost running out. Even if the target is very close, they won't be able to get there in that time. Their wrists continued to be restrained. If they were free of the curse of the chains, they could split up and try to reach the top in their own way. A thought occurred to the leader. He began to think things through. They can't touch or see her, but they are all connected by a chain. It's vulnerability, because if one falls, all fall. But if you look at it from the other side, if one goes up, everyone goes up, that can be an advantage. If one could turn a disadvantage into an advantage, maybe it would allow them to defeat a mithril-level adventurer and at the same time be able to complete the dungeon in time. Come on, we need to find a solution fast. Right now, Nagy is, albeit temporarily, the group's commander. If he were a real commander, he'd use every card he had. Each of them is insignificant on their own, but if you use their tools, their adventurer abilities, all those cards, something could have been worked out. With Mrs. Petra's tracker abilities, you can determine the landscape and calculate the distance to the target. If the distance is short, she can do it easily. She can even make a map. So we need to do it as soon as possible. Using her special skill as a tracker, Petra set to work. Wasting no time, she began drawing lines in the air with a quill pen. These lines connected to each other to form an exact copy of the castle on the top. The girl generated a three-dimensional map. The leader began to look at the creation, twisting it from side to side. It was marvelous. The accuracy of the map was higher than he expected. He praised Petra for her fine work. The girl really is an outstanding scout. It wasn't hard for her because it's the basics, the very basics. The inspector made a map, but how was the leader going to use it? They needed to analyze the monster. This battle is not a battle of man against man. It's a battle of man against monster. While scouring dungeons, adventurers often encounter monsters stronger than themselves. How on earth do they manage to defeat such monsters? Petra suggested that perhaps they are using experience and strategy? No, it's not like that. The secret by which adventurers can defeat a stronger monster is stealth, which included a few things, such as finding weaknesses, surprise attacks, and ambushes, using all manner of dishonest methods. That's how they win. Therefore, in order to defeat this monster, they also need to fight cunningly. With his foot on the ground, Nagi pushed off. He flew upward with lightning speed, splitting the air currents. With the help of a magic pouch, a crossbow appeared in his hand. An arrow flew toward Dullahan. The experienced warrior heard a whistling sound rapidly approaching him. He managed to intercept the arrow before it hit him. Nagi had thought it through carefully. If the ambush succeeded, even such a measly arrow could work. The arrowhead held a surprise. As soon as the big man grabbed it, sticky threads began to spread. Another special courier skill, the spider bomb. Spreading sideways, the threads wrapped around the warrior's arms and legs, chaining him to the ground. Dallahan had had enough of these mediocrities' resistance. Trying to free himself from the sticky web, the warrior saw Nagi climb up onto the platform. His hand was back in the bag. Would he really go head-on? The bully stared at him, trying to get an answer. Even so, the battle is worth a shot. Nagi's hand was already taking out the prepared surprises. The mushroom army took over the platform. The mushrooms with blue caps scattered in different directions. Dullahan watched their flight with interest. What was this guy up to? In the blink of an eye, everything became enveloped in bright light and smoke. The leader used his special skill, explosion of ash mushrooms. The warrior stood on an islet surrounded by a wall of smoke. The whole area was covered in a smoke screen. As he made his way through it, the big man thought about how annoying this guy was. From the puffs of smoke, Deshtar's voice could be heard. Following him, Nagi was able to find the crew. They were fine. That's perfect. Now we need the necromancer to be able to summon more minions. Deshtar looked at his hand. His index and middle fingers were regenerating, and he had just used the ring finger. That leaves the little finger and the thumb. That makes 2 creatures available. That's good. That should be enough. Nagi is ready to act. Everyone listened to him carefully. The courier had a plan to get out of this ass. Dullahan breathed a sigh of relief. He had finally managed to get rid of the annoying threads. He was so sick of this guy. He'd never heard of a swordsman who fought like that. Through the clouds of smoke, he began to look for his opponents. Had he and his allies hidden behind another rock? The warrior considered their attempt pointless. A familiar silhouette with a sack began to emerge from the thick smoke. The figure in the smoke, not noticing the bulky man, was saying something inaudible. A smug smile flashed across the warrior's face. That was so reckless. If you're setting up a smokescreen, at least don't give yourself away so obviously. He seized the moment to attack. Finally, he would be able to take down his tiresome opponent. The fist was raised upward. A glow began to envelop him, gathering all the power. Forming a bright light, a stream of energy rushed towards the figure. There was a hole in the smokescreen. Dullahan cheered up. Yes, at last the target was defeated. Or not, what is it? A minion's hand appeared out of the cloud. With a sharp movement, the puppet held the bulky man to his chest, thus preventing him from moving. It can't be a golem. How could a golem talk? No, it wasn't the golem. The sound was coming from that weird and baggy thing. Dullahan heard the voice again. I tricked you! Where's the kid? Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a rope that led upward. Nagi's arm wrapped tightly around her. Holding the rope, he prepared to climb up. The picture came together. It was a ruse to distract the warrior and secretly climb to the top. The bully was pretty pissed off. The swordsman was too rude. Now that he'd found them, there was no way they could climb that rope, even with the chasm that separated them. Nagi was of a different opinion. His opponent shouldn't be so cocky. There was a slurred exclamation from the necromancer. The leader asked him to speed up. They must hurry, for the warrior had already spotted them. Deshtar needed more time. We have to wait. This is the first time he's controlled at this distance. He used his last finger. There was no need to worry, he could handle it. The hook flew straight for the castle walls. He was on an important mission, delivering a very valuable cargo to the summit. Tied tightly with a rope, a necromancer's finger. Before he could reach his target, the finger began its transformation. It made a pretty cute belly bear holding a hook in his paw. Now it was his turn to deliver the package to the castle walls. The minion's foot stepped on the stone floor. Keeping the hook on his shoulder, he began to run, pulling the rope taut. The purple monster lay motionless in the same spot where he had been thrown. Mignon walked toward it. As he flew upward, he brought the hook over the dragon's body. Go! Shouted Deshtar, controlling his creation. There wasn't much time left. A hook jabs at Lindworm's body. The cute bear rounded up and began its glow. Chained in the doll's embrace, Dullahan noticed the explosion coming from the lock platform. He couldn't believe it. Could it be? This guy had planned all this to shackle him to this position. The minion's legs were tied with rope and chained firmly to the ground with stakes, and he continued to hold the bully down. A rope was pulled from a sack on his back. Dullahan was furious. The situation was becoming dangerous. The team had to leave now. The warrior's one hand frantically dug into the doll's arm, the second into his head, flattening it and turning it into a mess. Pulling back the adventurous team may not be easy. Although Deshtar's thumb is slow, it has the most power. Dullahan is going to have to work hard to get free. It was time for immediate action. The rope in Nagi's hands began to move. This is not a battle of man against man. It's a battle of man versus monster. Cracks formed in the stone wall beneath the dragon's body, and it began to splinter. The beast slowly began to slide down. There are monsters that cannot be defeated. The stone wall could not bear Lindworm's weight and began to collapse rapidly, falling down with him. And if Nagi's goal wasn't to destroy this monster, then why mess with it at all? The huge dragon in the air began to gain speed. The strong air currents made its jaws open. It was approaching the island where Dullahan stood in the arms of a minion. As he raised his head, he saw a huge open maw approaching him. It was ready to fall right on him. In a second, the warrior was in the air. As he turned in flight, he pushed the doll's huge body away from him, trying to free himself from its arms. Gramila couldn't believe it. Hook was still inside the dragon's body. The rope miraculously withstood the strain. Falling down, Lindworm continued to pull her behind him. The other end of her was rising upwards faster and faster. The rope started from one side of the platform on which the castle was located and crossed the island. The end of the rope was in a hook, which was pulled by a dragon falling from the opposite side. Nagi flew upward. Shackled by invisible chains, the team followed him. Gaining altitude, the leader's face was adorned with a smug smile. He watched as the fearless thug surrounded by rocks and a defeated dragon flew down. Chow! After climbing to the top, the team saw the castle. The guys made it, but they have to hurry. With all their legs, they began to run. We're just a little bit away. We've got to push on. The goal is within reach. The end of the dungeon was in sight. The team tried not to collapse from helplessness. There were about 5 minutes left. Although the time was tight, it was enough. On the run, Nagi was cheering the guys on. However, a lot of credit for the victory this time goes to Naranero, he said with a smile on his face, discouraging the girl. Alone, he would not have been able to throw the rope over 50 meters high to the summit. I couldn't believe it could only be done with pure strength. Gripping the hook in her clawed hands, the girl's shoulder was decorated with swollen veins. Swinging harder, she sent him straight to the top of the castle. That's really impressive. Naranero felt uncomfortable. The girl thought it was nothing. A little bit of effort, and it worked. Deshtar visibly tensed. He didn't understand why she was getting so much attention. Anyone could do it if they were strong enough. Even a fool, by insulting Naranero. But no matter who said what, it was himself who Deshtar considered the protagonist of the dungeon. After all, he had even defeated that boring berserker. And what's more, he was able to secure the rope in the right place. For a minute, the guy started to think he was even cooler than the mithril adventurer. Which surprised Naranero, because she only remembered the way he kept catching it in the face. Nagi and Petra, who were running ahead, were unusually amused by the argument between the two boys. At one point, the inspector joked that the boys seemed to her to be quite cheerful. The courier could not but agree. The leader suggested that this was probably the first dungeon sweep for them. And besides, victory feels brighter when everyone has made an effort, not one person dragging the rest of us down. Turning to Petra, he praised her for her tremendous contribution. The girl didn't understand what this was about, for she thought she had done almost nothing. The leader knew that scouts had a special skill for reading terrain, but it's usually limited to basic skills. But Petra instantly managed to create a very detailed map, thanks to which the boys were able to calculate the exact location. So we can confidently say that this is the level of a professional scout. The inspector's eyes lit up. She was pleased to hear that. Still, it seemed to her that there was a great deal of merit to Nagi here. How quickly he devised and executed this plan. I couldn't believe he was a regular delivery boy. How could someone like that be a courier? There was one question on everyone's mind. What would happen to the berserk? It was clear enough. For what he had done, he would have to rot in prison for the rest of his life. Some of the team members suggested that it would be a good idea to ban him from being an adventurer. Petra was overcome with doubt. Berserk, of course, had committed a serious crime, but the problem is that he's mithril rank. The higher the adventurer's rank, the more immune he or she is to penalties for crimes. The more adventurers of mithril rank receive government support, so in all likelihood, he'd just get a ticket. The girl with the cat ears was puzzled. How could this be? Unlike her, Deshtar couldn't contain his anger. It was driving him crazy. The annoyed necromancer couldn't leave it at that. Even if that was the law, he was willing to deal with it himself outside the dungeon. Nero, realizing the difficulty of the situation, wryly teased the boy. Was Deshtar really going to mash the big man's fists with his face again? The necromancer's thoughts seemed very dangerous to Nagi. After all, they had only seen a fraction of this berserker's power. It's only a matter of looking around. The corpses of the Knoll tribe that guarded the entrance to the castle. He killed them all by himself. A couple began to object to the leader. After all, they could have done it too, thinking that they just didn't get the chance. That's not what was important. If you look at the wounds on the Knoll bodies, you'd realize they were all killed in one blow. This information went through the minds of the cocky couple like a thunderclap. In one fell swoop, the adventurer's special skill is revealed when he uses a suitable item. And in the battle with these two, he didn't use his sword or his skill. Even with his bare hands, he gave them all a light. A realization began to come to the necromancer. Such a difference in level, Deshtar put his all into it. Now that he thought about it, it seemed true. When he sent Littlefinger to drop the lindworm, Dullahan's two-handed sword had already been stabbed into his heart. He might have also killed this boss with a single blow. Nagi turned to the necromancer and eyed him warily. It turns out he fell in with the lindworm, so he got his two-handed sword back, standing at a great distance from the castle platform. The thug looked upward, holding his sword in his hands. A huge chasm separated him from his opponents. Opening his mouth wide, he bared his teeth. Bingo. Now the warrior was ready to start the real game. A bright light began to appear in front of Nagi's eyes. It shone from the cracks in the ground that formed under Naga's feet. Turning to his team, the leader ordered them to scatter. The crack continued to widen, separating them from each other. Deshtar froze, looking at the flames coming from the rift. Growing more and more powerful, they fixed his gaze on them. With a swing of his sword, Dullahan used the berserk's special skill, Giant's Slash. A fierce stream of energy rushed upwards, cleaving the platform with the castle. Bloody fingers slid across the stone, trying to claw at it. Caught in the cleavage, the entire team found themselves on a precipice above the abyss, bound by the curse of the chains. Grasping the rock with all his might, the leader looked them over, wondering if they were all right. Petra felt fine. Her face was covered with only small abrasions, which is more than can be said for the other two contestants, who suffered more than the others. Especially Mr. Ban, he seems to have passed out. Nagi tensed, drops of sweat dripping down his cheeks. As he examined the dissection, he looked at the island where the warrior had been. It would take a monstrous amount of power to do such a thing. Moreover, Dullahan had almost caught up with them. He sprang from one islet to another, pushing himself closer to the summit. His eyes had no pupils at all. Now they were glowing with a bright light. Now, he really did look like a monster. If the boys hesitate, he will catch up with them immediately. There were only 3 minutes left. To stop this madness, we have to at least try to do something. Nagi was only a courier, but in all that time carrying countless loads, he's trained himself. So heavy weights are just a routine for him. Right now, the same thing is happening. It's just weight. Yes, it's a little heavier, but you can handle it. They still have a chance at salvation. A determined commander is sure to give them that opportunity. Clawing at the wall with bloody fingers, Nagi pushed forward with all his might. Grabbing onto the rock ledges, he walked confidently toward his goal, pulling his team along. With each skid of the arm, it became more and more difficult to, and time was running out. Besides, the berserker was almost upon them. He was very close. And the climb up didn't take much of his strength. Time waits for no one. Finally, the leader managed to climb onto the platform. He did. Throwing the unconscious Deshtar on his shoulders, he hurried forward. The girls followed him. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Only one jump separated the berserker from his victims, and he gladly made it. It won't be long before retribution comes to these crooks. It was not in Naga's plans to give up so easily. There's not much left to the coveted entrance. As we approached the arch, it was increasingly flooded with bright light. Without noticing the distance traveled, the boys found themselves within the castle walls. They saw a huge blue crystal floating in the air. This crystal is the core of the dungeon. All they have to do now is destroy it. Nagi slipped his hand into the bag. Taking out his sword, he thrust it into the core. It was just a matter of time. All we had to do was wait for the gun to pierce the blue mineral. With a rumble, the ceiling of the structure began to collapse, breaking the moment of anticipation. Dullahan punched it with himself, forming a hole. The leader froze, watching to see how events would unfold. In flight, the berserker easily repelled the courier's launched sword. Before he could finish what he started, the gun stopped its flight, lodged in the floor of the castle. As he landed, the warrior blocked the core, blocking its path. Time was up. The mineral behind the bulky man's shoulders began to crack. An explosion followed. Pink-violet rays enveloped the space. The annoyed leader clenched his teeth and glared fiercely at what was happening. The bright light continued to spread further. From the previously calm rift, swirls of fire began to emanate. It came to life, growing larger and larger. The hot streams began to envelop the village. Taking innocent residents by surprise, they forced them to flee. The only thing left for people to do was pray. Had God forsaken them? Above the watchtowers from a huge hole, the glow of the sun was visible, looming over the village. From the hole, creepy, shaggy faces began to show. Shrouded in tongues of flame, one by one they left their abode. With a horrible roar, the undead passed through the gate, flooding the ground with them. Toothy, bloodthirsty creatures. Huge dragons. The number of monsters was increasing. At one point, an invincible armed army of monsters gathered them. The exhausted girls sat on the ground and watched as the monsters inside the dungeon revived. They are innumerable. This is the dungeon rift. Squeezing Naga's throat tighter, the berserker burst into laughter. He enjoyed watching it happen. It looked spectacular. No matter how many times he watched it, he never got bored. This isn't the first time Dullahan has caused a rift. Such a small thing as a courier, he'll never understand anyway. After all, a dungeon that has been broken will rebuild itself over time, becoming even stronger. And that means the rewards in it get better. Naga's eyes were filled with disappointment. Was this all for the sake of the reward? Did the warrior not care at all about the harm it would do to the villagers? Berserk licked his lips. He didn't even pay attention to little things like this. The only thing he cares about is the loot. After all, he's not the kind of guy who cares about the life of ants underfoot. For the porter, this was a familiar situation. An adventurer is neither hero nor savior. He is often a scum who thinks only of his own gain. And he really hates scumbags like that. And when such a monster also gains great power, it won't turn out well for the world. The courier's eyes were fixed on the sky, looking at the bird that didn't fit in the picture. But there are, however rare, true adventurers, whose hearts have not been tainted by greed. On the back of the black, huge bird sat a blonde girl. She nonchalantly began eating her lunch. Watching what was happening, the blonde chewed the bun with great pleasure. Calmly finishing her meal, she was fully alert. It's hard to meet worthy adventurers, but it's even harder to meet equally strong ones. Rising to her feet, the girl deftly jumped off the bird. Doing a somersault in the air, she armed herself with her sword. Needing to destroy the monsters before the rift got any bigger, she went on the attack. First, the dragon was eliminated. The blonde channeled a huge stream of energy into the evil beast. The shaggy beasties followed. Under the power of her strike, they flew apart. Whining pitifully, the toothy creatures burned in the embrace of the flames. In a matter of minutes, the bastard army was defeated. Dullahan froze, looking at the merciless battle. The smile left his face. Finishing the fight, the long-haired blonde landed on one knee and stepped to the ground. Everyone, pay attention! I am Agnes Farid, deputy head of the Sunset Wind, she said as she got to her feet. What the hell happened here? She is a mithril rank adventurer. The rift was closing little by little, taking the hellhounds with it. Nagi fell to the ground. A trickle of blood dripped from the corner of his mouth. Dullahan finally let go of the boy. Petra ran up to him, worried about his well-being. The courier tried to regain his breath. His gaze was fixed on the ill-fated light source. The boys watched it close. Berserk was not at all happy with this arrangement. He clenched his teeth and stared at Agnes. The girl's skills impressed him. Even though it was a low-ranked dungeon, she had managed to beat it with a single blow. The warrior thought that the Sunset Wind Guild had long since collapsed. What's she doing here? Hadn't she retired 3 years ago? The blonde stood pensively. Judging by the sight, there was no need for unnecessary explanations here. In his hand, the sword reappeared. She knew that an adventurer with a mithril rank couldn't fail a sweep of this level of dungeon. That means that the rift was caused intentionally. The gun pointed towards the berserker, pointing at him. Dullahan's face was once again adorned with a smug smile. He's wanted to fight her for a long time, but now's not a good time. The swordsman wore him down with his tricks, causing him to expend more energy than he expected. Because of him, things didn't go according to plan. but the goal was accomplished. The warrior clutched a red orb in his hand. There's no need to fight anymore. It's time to put your sword behind your back. Had he really decided to run away? The blonde with long hair was indignant. Berserk began to look for an excuse, lamenting the complexity of the rift. After all, even for him, a mithril-ranked adventurer, it could be dangerous here. There were too many variables. Nero joined their conversation, calling the warrior a liar. His lie was not only that he purposely didn't clean up the dungeon, but that he was trying to kill them by preventing the rift from being prevented. Dullahan stood there with his mouth hanging open. It was like he was hearing it for the first time. Apologizing, he suggested that it was likely that this dungeon had a curse for the first adventurer who entered, which made it impossible to distinguish between allies. In other words, it wasn't his own choice to attack them. He managed to piss Nero off. After all, if there was any doubt, the deputy head could easily check everything herself. But what a shame! The dungeon had already disappeared. Feeling his impunity, the thug smiled. Petra knew the guild would accept such a report. It was obvious it was a load of crap. But in the court of adventurers, she'd seen it many times before. It's not the truth that determines the weight of a claim, it's the rank of mithril. No matter how much copper and porcelain are examined, their words are worthless against mithril. Even telling the truth is impossible to win. The worst part is that he knows it all and he's taking advantage of it. It seemed the conversation was over. The cunning adventurer waved goodbye and left. The team couldn't stand the fact that he could get away with it so easily. Be that as it may, Nagi was glad the rift had been stopped. Feeling his strength leaving him, he fell to his knees. Everyone stared at him. Farid, from over her shoulder, examined the courier. Nagi looked quite bad and was in an unconscious state. His hands and face were covered with countless abrasions. Taking the Thunder Eagle by the reins, Agnes offered her help. If we use a genin, we can get to the city quickly. It made no sense for the guys to refuse. After all, 2 members of their team could not even move on their own. Thus, the exhausting cleanup of the rift came to an end. The village met the morning without any cataclysmic events. Cheerful and joyful residents threw themselves into each other's arms. Later, the Adventurer Guild visited the village, apologized, and promised to prevent such incidents in the future. Of course, it was all just words, and Nagi, thanks to Agnes's help, traveled to the Adventurers' City in the west. Velet, a beautiful and clean city, filled with tall buildings and greenery. It was well protected by the strong walls that surrounded it. Somewhere in the city, among the tall buildings, there was a small 2-story house. On its roof, in a nest, sat a wooden eagle. This was the office of the Sunset Wind Guild. The courier, little by little, began to come to his senses. Barely opening his eyes, he didn't realize where he was, which made his eyes instantly widen. The boy was in a small, cozy room. Rays of sunlight woke him up. Sitting by the old bed, Petra was on duty. Making an attempt to rise, he felt a searing pain and groaned. Looking around, the porter saw a girl who had apparently fallen asleep while off duty. Having no idea where she was, the boy called out to her softly. With joy, Scout was instantly awakened. The other boys jumped up and rushed over to him with loud cheers. Nagi had no memory of what had happened, and he asked them to tell him about it. The last thing on his mind was the way the berserker was leaving. The team explained that they were in the Sunset Wind Guild office, and also that his savior was that stylish sister, who even called a priest from the church to heal him. Probably that was why, except for a little fatigue, there were no more wounds on the boy's body. Nagi's glad his team turned out okay. Ban, boasting that it was nothing to the best adventurers. And Nero didn't even break a sweat. Clenching his fist, Deshtar rasped, admitted that as for his first adventure, it was a grand adventure. Seeing how the villagers rejoiced to learn that they had stopped the dungeon rift, the guy finally realized what it meant to be adventurous. People gave them small but meaningful gifts with great appreciation. After all, for a couple of adventurers, it's just a dungeon with rewards and glory. And for people, it was life-threatening. Residents awkwardly apologized for their past behavior, regretting that they had behaved so rudely in the past. The boys rejoiced like children at the salvation of the village. Their plans were to become great. Nagi thought it was great. Yes, fortunately, the village was defended. But now that it's over, it's time for him to come clean. Glancing at the medallion in his hands, the porter thought about how best it would be to confess that he was not a gold adventurer, that in fact he is below their rank, a regular porcelain courier. Would they be able to treat him the same way knowing that? Probably not. After a bit of deliberation, he made up his mind after all. He asked the boys not to be angry at what he was about to say. Satisfied, they were ready to listen to him. Nagi revealed that he was hiding his identity. He pretended to be an adventurer, pretending to be a squad leader. As expected, their response was cold. The bond built on lies was gone, and they were back to being couriers and adventurers, briefly making an understanding look. They headed for the exit, asking the porter to rest. The door closed behind them. Their banter could be heard from the hallway. Petra could not understand why he had to tell the truth. To which, with a kind smile, the boy replied that they would soon become splendid adventurers. Nagi was sure they would meet again in this city while he was working as a courier. And you can't build a relationship on a lie. The girl couldn't contain her emotions. As he said himself, he's not an adventurer. She had seen them many times while she worked as an inspector. Most of them are only in it for their own gain. And they're not shy about committing crimes. They are neither heroes nor saviors, but those who only want profit. Nagi-san, however, was not like that. He cleaned up the dungeon even though it didn't benefit him at all. He only risked himself to save the village, and demanded no reward. That's why he's not just an adventurer. You're a hero, taking his hand gently, Petra said. At this point, the delivery man became quite uncomfortable. Mentally, he went back to the events of that time. Things had happened a little differently. For a moment, everyone was absorbed in Dullahan and Agnes's conversation. Sitting on the ground, Nagi noticed something. It was a reward for cleaning up the rift. Without hiding his joy, he rushed to the chest. So after putting himself out to the end, he collected the entire reward and fell down without strength. Flying in his thoughts, the courier did not notice how he was already sitting on the bed in the arms of the bag. That was awesome, collecting all the loot twice in a row. Looking at him, the inspector began to feel awkward. On this day, it wasn't just Petra who got Nagi wrong. Nero and Bondeshtar too. Left alone, they decided to discuss the situation. So their boss was just an ordinary courier? They seemed to be thinking the same thing, that it was just a legend made up for them. He pretends to be a porter, hiding his true power, when in fact he is a golden adventurer. The guys thought they were just being fooled, but it didn't work. It would be their secret. They promised each other to keep the secret, to keep the legend alive. These two were far more stupid than Nagi had thought. Though, considering the way he'd acted during the sweep, they were understandable. Meanwhile, in the other direction, this small incident began to grow like a snowball, turning into an avalanche. Dullahan's foot crossed the threshold of the guild. He had an important conversation to have. The man in the white robe who stood with his back to him started first. He'd heard about what happened. He'd heard about the interference too. Standing in front of the head, Dullahan had no choice but to apologize. He said that he had first been attacked by some children, and then the wind of the sunset intervened. But in any case, the goal had been achieved. He turned around and looked at the berserker and asked if he had forgotten about himself and Vanesslo. After all, the Dawn Guild does not forgive those who interfere with their plans. And it doesn't matter if it's a fake adventurer or a sunset wind. In the middle of the room, immersed in her thoughts, stood Agnes. She kept thinking about what she had heard from Mrs. Petra on the way. As they made their way to the city, Farid asked the girl for details. About why they were there and why the man had been hurt so badly. She needed to know all the details. The inspector couldn't find the words and kept stammering. The blonde was aware that they had entered the rift illegally. It wasn't hard for the deputy head to find out by checking the squad's composition. But that wasn't important. What was going on now was a private conversation. Agnes was not authorized to hold the girl responsible, but only wanted to find out for herself. After all, she was investigating a chain of dungeon rifts that had recently started happening in the neighborhood. During the investigation, a lead was found that may be connected to the Dawn Guild. It was for that reason that the girl found herself there today. Petra had heard of the rift chain, but she didn't know the guild was connected to it. In solving this hypothesis, the blonde could be helped by the information received from them. The inspector was willing to lend her assistance. In return, asking that Mr. Nagi's illegal actions be kept secret. Perhaps, when she knew everything, she would even be able to praise him. The girl gathered her thoughts and told him what had happened. Standing in the middle of the room, Agnes pondered about the golden adventurer who had actually turned out to be a courier. Still, he had almost succeeded in clearing the dungeon. If it wasn't for the guild dog Dawn, he would have definitely made it. Under his leadership, a rift that even adventurers avoided was cleared. It seems unbelievable. That is why he deserves more respect. His determination to throw himself into a place where he could die in order to prevent a rift. Opening the door of the room, she saw Nagi standing by her bed. Noticing Agnes, he said, "You saved us." The girl inquired about his well-being. Thanks to her, he was fine. Raising her index finger up and pointing it at the courier, she said, "I, Agnesa Farida, deputy head of the Sunset Wind Call, become my co-partner." Smiling, the courier replied with a refusal. The Guild of the Sunset Wind is located in the western city and was once considered one of the most famous and respected. However, after the disappearance of the head of, she began to decline. In such an environment, the guild, after a long time, finally held a meeting. The girl in white form and purple hair began to object. She was against it. No matter how hard times are for their guild, they can't accept just anyone. This is Anne Dorothy, she's the treasurer, and a gold-ranked summoner. A trio of counselors were holding a meeting sitting around a huge table. Nains, a gold-ranked knight, was in complete agreement with his colleague. He thought Agnes's decision was too arbitrary. Plus, there's talk that the guy's just a courier posing as an adventurer. Con man, that was too much. Ferroro, a priest of copper rank, was a mercenary sent from the White Order. She thought the counselors were too hard on him and decided to vote for him, which surprised Anne immensely. She, in turn, suggested that the guy must have a very handsome face. The flushed priestess could barely contain her emotions. What was this treasurer doing? After all she was doing was focusing on healing. He did look good with his hair down, though. The big bear named Stoneman asked the girls not to argue. It was useless to argue, because Agnes had already made up her mind. The girls immediately turned their attention to him. Each considered him a traitor, and Ferroro even threatened to refuse to treat him. To say he wasn't happy about this turn of events is an understatement. Interrupting the argument, a female voice addressed them, saying there was nothing else to think about. After all, the guild had been turned down. The unusually surprised counselors said the word in one voice. What? How is that possible? Petra watched Nagi sitting on the bed, gathering her belongings into a bag. Tightening the straps, with my hair in a ponytail, he was ready to hit the road. It seemed to the girl that the boy was leaving too soon. Perhaps he should have gotten some more rest. But the courier felt fine. And from idleness, he was overcome by a feeling of anxiety. Determined, she asked him why he refused to join the guild. There were many benefits to being a member. Yes, the guy realized that the guild offered many advantages. But on the other hand, difficult relationships with people brought more trouble. That's why he liked to stay as he was now. Since it was his decision, the inspector didn't insist. However, after 2 encounters with the Dawn Guild, perhaps it was safer to be protected? The boy told her not to worry. He'd already gotten out of the water a little wet twice, and he'd be fine the 3rd time. Besides, why would they worry about a courier like him? She just hoped they would. It was time to return to the guild. Nagi thanked her nicely for everything. Turning to leave, she suggested that he seek her help if necessary. When the door closed behind the inspector, the guy finally remembered something important. It's time to check out the reward before you go. Whatever it was, I wish it was some kind of expensive item. Looking into the open sack, the porter called out to Glottoni. But not waiting for an answer, he decided to look for him himself. Where had he gone? Looking around the corners of the bottomless vault, the guy still didn't see him. Suddenly, clad in a pink apron, a baby boy suddenly appeared in front of him. There he was. What took him so long to come out? And what was that outfit? Missing, stood in front of a chest, from which came sounds like a dog barking. The creature looked at its master and said the sounds meant nothing. It felt awkward, as if it had been caught in the act. Turning to Glottoni, the boy asked if he had checked the contents of the chest. To which he replied, nothing. The courier made a surprised look and pretended to cover his mouth with his hand. Really? Nothing at all? Suspiciously. Nothing suspicious at all. It's fine, answered the little boy. A sense of interest took over. Pushing the trickster aside, Nagi began to open the chest. What's in there? What he saw threw him into a stupor. Inside sat 3 creatures. But who were they? The boy began to speculate. Are they puppies? No, baby monsters? But why were they in the trunk? Expecting to see the long-awaited reward, the annoyed courier looked at the stone lover. What's going on? With an innocent look, Glottoni set about explaining himself, as usual, sorting through the loot. He opened the chest to clean up the mess. Inside were many stones that looked like eggs. At some point, a small paw showed through the shell. The creature had never seen such a miracle before. It was delighted. Thus, 3 babies were born. Nagi began to ponder. If that was the case, then maybe there were monster eggs in the chest. Sometimes the animal tamers take them away. But these creatures have already hatched, and look like the handlers won't want to take them. What a shame. He spent a lot of items in this dungeon, expecting to make up for it with rewards. Now he doesn't even know what to do with them. Glottoni assumed that their parents were enslaved by Lindworm and lived in the Celestial Citadel as slaves. To save the children, the parents hid them in rocks. Well, that explains a lot. The creature was thrilled at the thought of keeping the babies and raised them. Nagi liked his idea. 3 creatures. It really wasn't that bad. He hoped nothing terrible would happen, and he allowed the rock lover to grow them. With a condition. If they made a mess in the bag, he would throw them out at once. The contented little boy glowed with happiness. Guys, I'm allowed, he addressed the creatures. You can stay. There were dozens of pairs of eyes looking at him intently. Nagi didn't expect to see an entire army. At that moment, he felt uneasy. Once out, he laughed a long time at the contented barking coming from the bag. He was not at all prepared for this turn of events. Unfortunately, the dungeon-breaking reward was useless. But there was still a reward for the cave dungeon. Soon the guy was heading into town, and ended up in a trophy exchange. By selling magic stones and monster trophies, he made a good amount of money, getting a not-so-subtle bag of gold for them. Oh, it had been a long time since he'd held so much money in his hands. For starters, he needed to buy everything he had run out of, like smokescreen mushrooms. Also, explosive mushrooms, which he couldn't afford before because of their price. Also, you need to replenish your food supply, fix weapons, buy arrows. And 2 small but weighty sacks he asked them to give to the adventurers, named Bon and Nero. Even after all those purchases, he still had gold left. While savoring an ice cream in the form of a slice of watermelon, the courier pondered how to spend the rest. The idea of taking a gastronomic tour seemed like a pretty good idea. Satisfied, he sprinted through the streets of the city, not even realizing he was being watched. Naga's persona was of great interest to the guy watching him from the rooftop. After all, he was the one who decided to oppose the Dawn Guild. When the observer heard about it, he couldn't believe it was really porcelain. They say the bastard threw the petty thieves in jail. Not only that, but he pulled a stunt against Dullahan too. Looking at his shadow, the blonde turned to it. What do you think, Zero? Does this guy look strong? An immediate reply followed in the blink of an eye. If it's happened twice, it's a mismatch. Even porcelain is something to watch out for, Nade. Winking back at her, the boy started to get to his feet. He couldn't even think that he would ever be sent against China. Unfolding the kunai, he hoped the courier could show him something interesting. Pushing off the roof, he rushed forward with a bullet. The unsuspecting porter calmly strolled the streets of the city, enjoying dessert and not thinking about anything. But in an instant, the calm was replaced by wariness. The popsicle stick in his fingers split in 2. Dodging the blow that followed, Nagi dropped his sweetness. What could this man possibly want from him? The agility and willingness to repel the porter's attack unusually surprised the blonde man. Could he have sensed his bloodlust and react to it immediately? Nade was intrigued. This guy was clearly an unusual courier. However, he hoped that would be the end of it. Fake embarrassed, Nagi was ready for any developments. A flash flashed in front of his face. Slashing the air with the weapon, the blonde man knocked his opponent to the ground. He waited for the moment when China would finally reveal what he had used against their guild. With a smile that never left his face, the delivery man started to get up. Who is this guy? His badge denotes that he is a gold-ranked mage. But the movements, it's a killer fighting style. Since he is so openly demonstrating his hostility, you can't just sit back and do nothing. Nade will finally see what he came to see, what this swordsman who bullied Jeff was capable of. A sword glinted in Nagi's hands, with cute, modified mushrooms with a red cap tied to the tip. Included in the special toolkit, with the help of which a truly great mushroom explosion was achieved. Believing it was madness to fight adventurers in the open, the carrier decided it was best to run away first. Exhausted by the escape, he found himself on a crowded street, screaming at the top of his voice for help. Claiming the robbery, Nagi started calling for the guards. Hearing the eerie cries, the keeper of order went to their source. Pointing to the place where he had been attacked, the porter told his story of how he had been tried to kill by an adventurer who was actually a bandit. A man the guard knew well came out to them. After all, he is a member of the Dawn Guild. The latter was very disappointed by the courier's flight. Nagi remembered what Petra had said. But even so, why make a mess of the city center? The enforcer needed to get to the bottom of what was going on. He started questioning the ringleader. In Nade's opinion, all of his actions are just a form of parenting. Pushing off the ground, he sprinted into his opponent. The hard jolt took the guy's breath away. With all his might, he hit the wall. As he continued, the blonde told him that poison had been put in the food of their adventurers, which had disrupted the cleanup. As a result, he was left without payment. Everyone knows what happens to those who harm the Dawn Guild, right? Out of injustice, the porter began to shout that everything said was a lie. He argued in vain that their men were trying to kill him. There was not a shred of trust in the eyes of the crowd gathered around him. Explanations were useless. It was just as Mrs. Petra had said, the Dawn Guild had great influence. In such a situation, no one would side with China. It is simply not profitable to defend it. On the contrary, it might even be detrimental. It will be more profitable for everything to support the guild. The crowd behind the guard's back was becoming furious. People made no secret of their displeasure with the porcelains and loudly proclaimed it. Under mounting pressure, the keeper of order decided to leave it up to Nade. He thanked him in turn for his understanding. The blonde looked at Nagi with a smirk on his face. He would find no allies here. The situation was unfavorable for him. But why are they doing this? If only they could find out the truth, they would realize that he is innocent. Besides, it's already over. What's the point of revenge? It wasn't the courier's fault. In another time, such things wouldn't have meant anything, even considering that it concerned the lower members of the guild. But there was one very important nuance. He had caused them damage. To preserve their reputation, you need to let everyone know that they are not to be trifled with. Fear is the best helper in this endeavor. Whoever decides to go against it always gets a backlash. The bearer will be a kind of reminder for all to see and remember this fact. Don't worry, Nade won't kill him. He wears the marks of the men he killed, but China doesn't deserve it. From this day forward, every time people would look at the scars on Nagi's face, they would be reminded of the guild. That'll be the mark. Pulling out the weapon, the blonde decided to use his special skill, 90-degree dissections. The intersecting lines were already closing in on the guy's face, preparing to leave the ill-fated memorial. Couriers can't have allies, but this time, someone's sword stopped the rampage. Agnes stopped the illegal action. She ordered Nade to put the weapon away. After all, Nagi is now a member of their guild Sunset Wind, and from now on, any attack on him will be considered an attack on them. The blonde man walked the streets of the city, listening carefully to what the shadow was saying. Can he be sure of being able to just walk away? After all, more was expected of him, wasn't it? But there was no choice. Fighting Farid was not in their plans. On the other hand, even if the guy did decide to fight her, it wouldn't be a big deal. But the girl, unfortunately, was already busy with someone else. So in the end, he just wasted his energy. This courier had to be someone of significance. Though the guy was quite skillful, in practice he still turned out to be an unremarkable weakling. It may have ended ignominiously, but after something like that, he'd probably be scared to death and couldn't do anything else. Shadow didn't share his optimism. Does Nate really think this is the end of it? Droplets of blood began to trickle from the cut on his cheek. What? When did the porter get to him? Or did Agnes do it? Trying to open the guy's eyes to what was going on, the dark image with a wry smile remarked that he didn't even realize how it happened. In that case, he should have slowly remembered everything. Step by step, wrapping his hands around the boy's face, the shadow opened his eyes with his fingers. It was time to see things from a different angle. Images of what was happening began to scroll through the blonde's mind. From the very first moment he met the courier, until the moment he tried to finish him off. Nade was sure the man had already given up trying and resigned himself to it. But the guy didn't give up, and he waited patiently for his chance. The moment the mark was ready to adorn the courier's face, a knife showed from his sleeve. Even in this situation, the porter took advantage of the fact that the warrior's gaze was directed upward. In this world, no one would take the courier's side. His duty was to protect himself. Gathering all the anger in him, Nagi threw his dagger at his opponent. Repelling the attack, the weapon headed straight for the warrior. It slid across his cheek, leaving a cut. The blonde man's dark side had told him so many times. Once he thought he had won, he would become distracted and vulnerable. Nade realized that he'd missed his shot because of his overconfidence. Looking at his bloody hand, he licked the blood off his fingers. The delivery guy can't get away with this. We can't leave it alone. We have to deal with this guy. The dark image was happy with his work. Covering his mouth, he chuckled softly. It was time to hide the dagger in his sleeve. Nagi carried it just in case he couldn't get the weapon out of the bag. Of course, it wasn't enough against an adventurer. If Agnes hadn't helped him, it would have gotten dangerous. Nade, who is this guy anyway? These thoughts kept me on my toes. Was it really necessary to send an adventurer of this level just for revenge? In truth, the porter wanted nothing more to do with him or this guild. Completely immersed in his thoughts, he felt a heavy hand come down on his shoulder. It was Naines and Stoneman. In an attempt to cheer the boy up, they made some jokes. It was obvious that he still couldn't get what had happened in the square out of his mind. Nade, a notorious scoundrel even among his own. Since he runs the slum bandits, even the guards prefer not to touch him. The guys were walking and talking about how badass this guild was. After all, even if someone made enemies, how could someone attack a person right in the center of the city? That was why, Agnes thought, it was too dangerous to stay in the city. She decided it would be safer to go underground. The girl didn't stop trying, and again offered the courier to join them for the sweep. In fact, he didn't care. He would just continue his work, which he would be glad to do. Giving his assent, the boy felt himself begin to shiver from the cold. It was the first time he had seen a graveyard dungeon of such high rank. It looked very bleak indeed. The team was surrounded by crosses and darkness. Suddenly, Nanes burst into laughter. "Scared?" he asked. For them, a dungeon like this is a cakewalk. In the guy's opinion, the courier just needs to rely on them, collect trophies, and keep up. And in case of danger, Stone suggested hiding behind his back. Even though their plan didn't appeal to Nagi, there was some truth to what they said. Even though they were B-class, they had 1 gold and 1 copper adventurer. But more importantly, they had Mithril. With an uber soldier like that, their strength is already more than they need. But there was something that was a bit worrying. Usually in B-class dungeons and above, it's important to balance the group composition or match it to the dungeon itself. With them, everyone belongs to a combat class. If the whole team focused on one type of combat, it would be harder to deal with unexpected situations. Considering the dungeon, it would be good if they had a priest with them. Naga's musings were interrupted by the deputy head. She ordered everyone to stop. It looked like they were about to be greeted. The undead began to emerge from the ground, forming an entire squad of armed zombies. They were moving right at the team. Wasting no time, the blonde armed herself with a sword. Pushing off the ground, she was ready to clear the way with ease. A stroke of the sword, and the re-hollowed parts of the undead flew in the air. She was very good at what she did. Bringing a fiery sword over a troop of dead men, the girl struck again. Tongues of flame enveloped the dungeon. Spinning around the blonde formed a ring of flame around her. Once hit, the zombies would burn up. The boss emerged from the firelight. He was much larger than his squad, and he strode toward the girl. The big man opened his mouth and roared, preparing to attack. His wiry arm took the form of a huge hammer. He was ready to crush his opponent with it. Without much effort, Agnes dodged, leaving the monster no chance to win. In a flash, she flew upward and did a flip in the air. Once behind the monster's back, the blonde was preparing to use her fire skill. Pushing off the wall, she began to dissect the boss's body. The flames that enveloped him created a living torch from him. Fire blazed from within. Agnes only had a small finishing touch to put on. The bud. As it unfolded, it sizzled the invincible thug. The girl, without much difficulty, brilliantly pulled it off. The adventurers had a great deal of fun watching what was going on, feeling like the audience of a thrilling superhero movie. It seemed worrying about the composition of the group was unnecessary. Nagi had seen many adventurers, but this was the first time he had seen such powerful talent. It was the foundation. Every adventurer has a talent that allows them to unleash their unique power that matches their class. And the abilities depend on each one individually. This is why adventurers are able to fight monsters that surpass them in strength. Especially if it were to be a mithril, its talent level is beyond reasonable comprehension. Farid pointed out that now was not the time to procrastinate. Before these things are resurrected, they need to move on. Without wasting a moment, the team set off. After all, resurrection was the main feature that distinguished graveyard dungeons from normal dungeons. The monsters in these dungeons tend to be weaker in level than in other dungeons. But the difficulty lay elsewhere. Killed zombies rise up again and again. The undead that have already been destroyed will endlessly revive and haunt them. If you move too slowly, they can surround you from both sides. And then the probability of a successful passage will decrease dramatically. So in such cases, it is important to either bring a priest capable of performing an exorcism or use holy water sold in a church. But the problem is that both are expensive. A loud roar was heard behind the boys' backs. The dead began their rebirth again and began to follow them. Naines, before going into the dungeon, told the team to take Ferroro with them. But they didn't listen to him. This is the first time the courier has heard of her. Who is she? This girl is a priest in their guild, who's always hanging around their base like she's at home. The guy didn't like her because she demanded a lot of gold every time. The devil in the guise of innocence. This time was no exception. She demanded an exorbitant amount of money to go with them. Ironically, he pointed out that their guild was so poor that even Ferroro couldn't afford it. And she's a lousy healer. When Agnes heard this, she immediately put him off, because he could complain later. Now's the time to get down to business. She'll take the enemies in the front. Stone, on her orders, will hold off those coming from behind. The warrior went to work immediately, remembering Nines' tearful complaints. The blonde offered to at least cheer them on, putting the guy in an awkward position. Picking up the baton, Nagi decided to tease him himself as well, asking if he was going to fight. Slurring to explain himself, the guy suddenly remembered the absence of his weapon. He'd forgotten it. The courier stood in a stupor. How could a warrior forget his weapon? The excuse was the haste in which they were going. In principle, the team didn't expect anything else from him. As Farid had pointed out, he was always forgetting things. Stone couldn't agree more. The worst was the time he showed up for a sweep without clothes. The warrior yelled at the top of his voice, ordering everyone to be quiet. Laughing, the porter began to pull a spare weapon from his sack. Without stopping his banter, Nagi asked what kind of sword Naines preferred. Since he's a knight, perhaps a longsword? Or a bastard? Making the guy really angry. Grabbing the courier by the shoulder and pulling him sharply towards her, the warrior threw a head kick with all his might, knocking his opponent to the ground. Sitting on the ground, the assailant began to rub his forehead. He didn't see that coming. "I don't fight with any other sword but Elizabeth Lovest," a guild member declared. It was his knightly vow. The courier was in utter confusion. "You shouldn't have left your Elizabeth." Stone broke the resulting silence, drawing the guy's attention to the fact that the monsters that are chasing them are kind of weird. There are fewer of them than expected, and they are moving slower. Looking closely, Agnes did indeed notice something strange. From the feet of the undead, pieces of metal with some sticky, stretchy mass were sticking out. Looking closer, the girl realized that these pieces were actually thorns. With a smug smile, the porter confirmed it. After all, these monsters still come back to life, don't they? And the main danger in this dungeon is being surrounded by revived husks. Of course, you can just kill them, but it's more effective to slow them down. The secret was a trap of thorns and glue balls. The guy was spreading them out as he moved. True, these are simple things, so you shouldn't expect much from them. Stunned by this, Stone and Farid's mouths dropped open. It seemed that the porter was more useful than Nines. Today's total plot contribution. Agnes, 100 points. Nagi, 30 points. Stoneman gets 10 points for cuteness. Nines, 0 points. Moving further down the dungeon, the boys wondered the same thing. How much longer will these things be reborn? Naines went on and on about Elizabeth and her invaluable help in fighting the undead, which made the blonde quite angry again. After all, now was not the time to complain. They needed to get out of here before the zombies surrounded them. The end of the cave was already in sight. It was very close. Agnes commanded the fluffy man. It was time to act. Turning toward the tendrils, Stoneman immediately applied his skill as a defender by building a stone shield. A tall structure blocked the zombies' path, preventing them from getting any further. Though the defense looked solid, still under the strong onslaught of undead, it would not last long. They need to get out of here as soon as possible. Soon the boys found themselves in the underground lake area. Annoyed, Nines began to complain again about the huge lake blocking their path. There was something good here, though. Surrounded by water and rocks, a raft was waiting for them on the shore. There was no choice. They would have to float on this shit to continue their journey. And since the zombies could come at any moment, they had to hurry. Naines dared to suggest that the fetus could not bear the weight of their armor, especially Stoneman's stone armor, to which he received another dose of sarcasm from Agnes. Since he wasn't fighting anyway, the girl suggested that he just drop the armor. Joining the blonde's words, Nagi also jabbed him with a sneer. The knight was beyond angry. Opening the sack, the courier happily offered to fold his armor inside. For what it's worth, it really could have helped. Upon reflection, the guys did begin to strip off all the excess. Watching them, Agnes began to feel uncomfortable. Continuing to undress, the knight at one point found himself in just his underwear. Unable to stand it, the indignant girl stopped him. The raft with the adventurers set sail. During their foray through the waters of the dungeon, a smile never left the adventurer's face. Sticking out his tongue, he began to banter with the blonde, pointing his finger at her. Her embarrassment at the removal of her armor kept him on his toes. Soon receiving a poke in the eye, the guy timidly apologized. He promised to keep his clothes with him from now on, to which Agnes asked to at least bring a gun. The boy kept talking about the power of the oath, which he could use to get through this dungeon alone. In the girl's opinion, that was the problem. Why promise something you can't keep? Their argument set Nagi to thinking. It is said that adventurers with the talent of a knight take oaths expressing their faith. This imposes strict rules on them that must be followed, but in exchange gives them immense power. Mr. Nain swore that he would not fight with any weapon other than Elizabeth Lovest, which put restrictions on him. But in return, his sword became a legendary weapon that could not be broken. It's a real exchange. However, it begs the question, isn't it kept secret so that it doesn't become a weakness? Looking at the courier, the girl confirmed his speculation. That's basically what happens. But in his foolishness, the knight told everyone, so everyone in this city knew of his oath. Agnes always thought he was a fool, so one might not be surprised. When she looked at the bag, which impressed her, the girl began to ask the porter about it. Does the weight disappear completely if you put something inside? The guy told her that the weight did not disappear completely. The moment an item is placed in the bag, a powerful weight lightning spell is cast on it. Perhaps even if you add up the weight of 2 sets of armor, they will be lighter than a normal stone. Hearing this, Stone assumed that this item was incomparably more valuable than Nain's sword. And also, he couldn't help but praise the specially prepared turkey, which was absolutely delicious. He couldn't imagine eating such a dish in a place like this. The knight joined in his admiration, talking about a blonde girl who, even while fighting zombies, was busy eating buns. The indignant girl countered that she just didn't have time to eat properly, unlike him, who was idling while she hunted. Their argument was interrupted by Nagi. It looked like things were about to get started. Ships with zombies on board were approaching their raft. The team was surrounded. Countless vessels were moving right towards them. So this raft really was a trap for adventurers. It is. There's no profit in fighting on it. Agnes knew that, but she sat on it anyway, having no other choice. This is a dungeon. No one is going to help by providing a raft. Even knowing about the trap, the main problem was the number of zombies. There are too many enemies. Only she could fight here. If the girl starts mopping up undead boats, the adventurer's raft will become a target for arrows sooner. Unexpectedly, the courier offered his help. After all, fighting them on the water will be difficult. The best option is to break through them. Tying the sack to the logs, the lad proceeded with his plan. Smiling broadly, he asked everyone to hold on tight. The guys were confused, not knowing what to expect. The courier decided to use his secret skill, which made the bag swell. Climbing up, the guy reached for the rope to loosen it. The ensuing airstrike began to carry the adventurer's raft away at an unprecedented speed. The team members were grabbing at everything they could. The flow was so strong that it looked like magic was involved. The wind whistled in his ears, and the porter had to shout to be heard. There was really no magic at all. He was only squeezing and releasing the air he had saved beforehand. Once leaving his bag in a windy spot, he realized it was possible. And if released all at once, you get roughly what they've already had the opportunity to observe. The archer is a monster pulling the bowstring in his gun, sent an arrow toward the team. The fire was coming from all directions. There were more and more undead. Grasping the end of the rope, the courier let out some more air, which gave the raft an opportunity. Get out of the trap for a while. There was a very unpleasant surprise ahead of them. The path was blocked by a wooden wall. The zombies have managed to set an elaborate trap. If you try hard enough, Agnes can break through it. After gaining enough speed, Nagi unhooked the bag and suggested that the girl act as a team. After all, fire and wind go well together. The blonde armed herself with a sword, and the courier had a sack ready. With their synergy, it was possible to create a powerful fire vortex that tore down everything in its path. The monsters shrouded in flames shrieked angrily, and the impregnable wall, covered with cracks, shattered into little pieces. Bursting through the flames, the raft with the adventurers managed to reach its destination. And at the head of the team was a fearless blonde woman pointing the direction. The broken raft lay by the rocks. Barely getting there, the team started looking around at each other, trying to see if they were okay. The girl recognized the place. They have entered the area of the Fortress of Death. It seems that this is where the boss of this dungeon is located. The underground fortress was located in a crypt. The scale of it was impressive. The team looked around. It seemed too complicated to them, much more complicated than B rank. A normal squad would have failed here for sure. The knight didn't like that their guild always chose the most difficult dungeons. He didn't like the fact that their guild always chose the most difficult dungeons. The blonde didn't share his opinion, because that's why they existed, to take such tasks. Yes, it was too hard for a first dungeon. Mishka thought that it was unusual for Naga to prefer clearing dungeons that others avoided. In fact, the courier did not care what kind of dungeons to go down. After all the difficulties fall on the adventurers. You can't let your guard down here. In places like this, the boss always brings trouble. But fortunately, he decided not to keep the team waiting. The figure sitting on the throne spotted the adventurers and came toward them. The monster didn't like that kind of company, How dare these fools invade his domain? This was the first time the guys had seen the Lich King being in a rank B dungeon. On the other hand, he's magic, and magicians are unpredictable. Agnes spent too much energy going through the whole ordeal alone. That meant only one thing. She needed to get it over with quickly before anything went wrong. Armed with her sword, the girl went on the attack. Jumping up, she was above the king, preparing to deliver her famous blow. The monster stood motionless, watching her. Most undead are dumb zombies that just run at their target. Leech, however, is different. His thirst for knowledge stays with him even after death. He began to understand the meaning of Agnes's actions. Quickly realizing her desperate dash was to protect the allies behind her. He immediately found a solution. The demon seemed to just disappear into thin air. Reappearing from the ceiling, he loomed over the team. It was his magic jump called a blink. The creatures he saw before him seemed rather stupid. Everything around him turned purple. Become my servants. That was the last thing Nagi heard before the blonde screamed. Look out! She shouted. Shrouded in chains, a huge palm hovered over the girl. The courier watched in horror. He realized that they might be facing the worst situation in this dungeon. The darkness consumed Agnes, securely chained. A purple vortex began to rise upward, followed by a pop. The image of a girl appeared out of the dissipating fog. But something was wrong with her. Now she was their enemy. Finding himself completely under the king's rule, Nanes decided to take matters into his own hands. He ordered Stoneman to take the courier away and run. The best option in this situation, the boys thought, was to run away. None of them would be able to stop Agnes. He was not happy with this arrangement. How can you even talk about escapism? A knight who never turns his back on his enemy! Today's contributions to the story. Agnes 100 points, Nagi 30 points, Stoneman 30 points, Nanes 10-point strip penalty. A noble knight who does not turn his back on the enemy. Perhaps it was overly vain, but Nanes felt incredibly cool and got a little teary-eyed at how beautifully twisted it was. Even if his opponent turned out to be Agnes, the guy knew she'd already used up a lot of energy. Her famous flame is also slowly going out, and it's no wonder because the girl almost single-handedly cleaned up the dungeon. With her present condition, it seemed possible to him that the idea of that he could handle her even with his bare hands.
Pet the cat.